Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The Shadow in the Salt Air. The man in the mirror was unrecognizable. His skin was raw, abraded, weeping clear fluid from 1,000 tiny wounds that he had inflicted upon himself with the pumice stone that lay bloody in the sink beside him. His eyes were wild, white showing all around the irises, and his mouth moved in a continuous litany of denial that rose and fell like waves breaking on a distant shore. "I can still smell it," Julian Barrington whispered to his reflection, his voice cracking with exhaustion and madness. "Sea salt and old fish, they say, that's all it is. Sea salt and old fish, but I can smell the sulfur. I can smell the sulfur underneath." He raised the pumice stone again, ready to resume his scrubbing, to remove another layer of skin in his futile attempt to cleanse himself of the thing that had touched him, that had entered him, that had made him into a vessel for its hunger. But his hand froze midair, the stone trembling in fingers that had lost their strength, and he stared at the cracked mirror with eyes that saw not his own reflection but the shadow that clung to it, the shadow that had wings where his should have none. Julian screamed then, a sound that carried through the thin walls of the concrete blockhouse, out into the night air of the village, across the white sand beaches, over the dark waters of the Indian Ocean. It was a scream that contained everything he could not speak, everything that had happened to him in the 3 weeks since he had arrived on Unguja, the main island of the Zanzibar archipelago, with his briefcase full of urban planning documents and his mind full of civilizational superiority. He had come to modernize them. That was his mission, assigned by the London planning firm that had won the contract to redesign the infrastructure of the coastal villages. He had come to bring running water and electrical grids and paved roads to people who still lived in ways that he considered primitive, superstitious, anachronistic. He had come with his degrees and his blueprints and his absolute certainty that the world was divided into the developed and the developing, the civilized and the backward, the rational and the ignorant. He had been wrong about everything. Julian lowered the pumice stone and let his hands fall to his sides. The bathroom was small, cramped, the walls sweating moisture in the tropical heat despite the fan that whirred overhead. Outside, the village was silent in a way that should have been peaceful but instead felt heavy, expectant, as if waiting for something to happen. The fire in the square had gone out. Julian noticed this with a part of his mind that was still capable of observation, still capable of the rational thought that had defined his existence before the night of the attack. Every night since his arrival, the villagers had maintained a massive bonfire in the center of the town square, feeding it with driftwood and palm fronds, surrounding it with their sleeping mats and blankets, refusing to retire to their homes until dawn. Julian had found this behavior quaint, charming, evidence of the rustic superstitions that he had encountered in his preliminary research on Zanzibari culture. He had read about the Popobawa, of course. Every urban planner assigned to the region received cultural briefings, summaries of local beliefs that might affect project implementation. The Popobawa was described as a traditional fear entity, a shape-shifting demon that attacked sleepers and forced them to confess its existence to others. It was categorized alongside other African folklore traditions, the Tikalosh of South Africa, the Ads of Ghana, the night walkers of countless cultures, as a psychological phenomenon, a manifestation of social stress and collective anxiety, not a real thing. Julian had believed this categorization. He had been certain of it. Until the night he ignored the warnings and slept in his bed. That had been 9 days ago. 9 days since the thing had come to him, had entered through the window he had left unshuttered despite the warnings, had descended upon him with a weight that crushed the breath from his lungs and a smell that had never quite left his nostrils. Rotting eggs, ancient brine, sulfur from the depths of the earth. The attack itself had been. Julian's mind shied away from the memory, trying to protect itself from the full horror, but the images forced themselves through anyway, had been clinical, precise, methodical. The creature had not killed him, had not even tried to kill him. It had been interested in something else, some form of violation that went beyond physical damage to a realm of psychological destruction that Julian was only beginning to understand. He could still feel it, the pressure on his chest, the cold, smooth skin that had pressed against his face, the voice like grinding stones that had whispered in his ear while he lay paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to do anything but receive whatever the creature chose to give him. "You will be my herald," it had said, its breath hot and sulphurous against his cheek. "You will tell them, you will spread the fear, or you will be consumed entirely." Then it had left, not through the window but through the wall, passing through solid concrete as if it were mist, leaving Julian gasping and shaking, and covered in a sweat that smelled not of human exertion but of something else, something that had come from the creature and stayed with him, marking him as its own. He had tried to tell the authorities. The local police had listened politely, had taken his statement, had promised to investigate. But he could see in their eyes that they didn't believe him, or worse, that they believed too much. They were afraid of him, he realized later, afraid of what he represented, what he carried, what he had become. The villagers knew. They had always known. When Julian emerged from his house the morning after the attack, walking stiffly, his eyes hollow, his skin pale, they had looked at him with expressions that mixed pity with terror. The Popobawa had chosen him. The Popobawa had made him its vessel. And now he was dangerous, contagious, a carrier of the hysteria that the creature fed upon. Omar had been the first to approach him. Omar, the tall, charming local who had befriended Julian on his second day, who had acted as his guide through the bureaucratic maze of village administration, who had seemed so helpful, so friendly, so genuinely interested in Julian's work. Omar had found him sitting on the steps of his rented house, staring at nothing, and had sat beside him without speaking, waiting for Julian to be ready to talk. "It came to you," Omar had said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough. "The Popobawa." Julian had nodded, unable to form words. "I know," Omar had said, and his voice had been gentle, compassionate, the voice of someone who had seen this before. "I know what it does. I know what it wants." "What does it want?" Julian had managed to ask. "Fear," Omar had said. "It feeds on fear. Not just individual fear, collective fear, mass hysteria, the terror of entire communities. The more people who believe in it, who fear it, who speak its name, the stronger it becomes. And when it finds a vessel, someone who has been touched by it, it uses them to spread that fear." "I'm not going to spread anything," Julian had said, his voice trembling. "I'm going to get help. I'm going to see a doctor. I'm going to." "You can't fight it with doctors," Omar had interrupted, still gentle, still patient. "You can't fight it with science. The Popobawa is older than science. It is older than the islands. It came here before humans, riding the volcanic winds from the depths of the earth, and it has been feeding on fear ever since." "Then what can I do?" Omar had been silent for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You can leave. You can go back to London, back to your world of concrete and steel and try to forget, but it will follow you. It has tasted you now. It has marked you. Wherever you go, it will find you, and eventually you will have to choose." "Choose what?" "Choose to spread the fear," Omar had said, "or choose to be consumed." That had been 8 days ago. Since then, Julian had tried to leave twice. The first time, he had reached the ferry terminal in Stone Town before discovering that his passport was missing, his wallet emptied, his return ticket voided. The second time, he had made it onto a boat before becoming violently ill, vomiting black fluid that smelled of sulfur, collapsing on the deck while the other passengers watched in horror. He was trapped. The Popobawa would not let him leave, not until he had fulfilled his purpose. And now, standing in the bathroom of his concrete block house, staring at his ravaged reflection, Julian understood what that purpose was. The creature had given him a choice, but it was not really a choice. If he warned the villagers, if he told them what had happened to him, he would trigger the mass hysteria that the creature craved. He would become the vector for fear, the spark that ignited the conflagration of panic. But if he remained silent, if he tried to endure, the creature would eventually grow impatient. And then it would return, not to whisper and threaten, but to consume entirely, to drag him into whatever dark dimension it inhabited, to make him into something worse than a vessel. Julian looked at the shadow on the wall behind him. In the dim light of the bathroom, it seemed to move, to shift, to acquire shapes that had nothing to do with the objects that supposedly cast it. He could see wings in that shadow, great leathery wings that spread across the wall like a cape. He could see a face, a single eye gleaming with malevolent intelligence. He turned around quickly, expecting to see the creature itself, but there was only empty space, only the door, only the cracked plaster of the wall. But when he looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, and now it was smiling. Julian fled the bathroom, fled the house, fled into the night air of the village. The fire in the square had indeed gone out, he saw now. Only embers remained, glowing faintly in the darkness, insufficient to hold back the shadows that seemed to press in from every side. The villagers had retreated to their homes, he realized. They had seen him coming, had seen the state he was in, and had fled. They knew what he carried. They knew what he was. "Julian!" The voice came from behind him, soft and familiar. Julian spun around, his heart hammering, and saw Omar standing in the doorway of a nearby house, silhouetted against the dim light within. "Omar," Julian gasped. "Help me, please, I can't fight this alone." "I know," Omar said, stepping forward into the moonlight. "That's why I'm here." He was different in the moonlight, Julian realized. Taller than he had seemed in daylight, his movements more fluid, more animal. His shadow stretched behind him, reaching across the white sand, and Julian saw that the shadow was wrong. It was too wide, too dark, possessed of shapes that no human shadow should have. "Your shadow," Julian whispered, pointing. "Look at your shadow." Omar smiled, and his teeth seemed too sharp, his eyes too bright. "I know, I have always known. The shadow and I are old friends, Julian, very old friends." Julian's voice failed him. The realization crashed through his mind like a wave, drowning his last vestiges of rational thought. "You're the Popobawa." "I am many things," Omar said, his voice changing, taking on the grinding quality that Julian remembered from the attack, the sound of stones being crushed together. "I am Omar when it suits me. I am your friend when it serves my purpose. But yes, when the night is deep and the fear is strong, I am the Popobawa, the shadow in the salt air, the thing that has no name but the ones humans give it." "Why?" Julian asked, the question coming out as a sob. "Why me? Why any of us?" "Because you were arrogant," Omar said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a terrible patience, an ancient weariness. "Because you came here thinking you could improve us, civilize us, bring your concrete and steel to our island and make us better. Because you believed that your science, your rationality, your education made you superior to our superstitions. And because deep down you were afraid. Afraid of the dark. Afraid of the unknown. Afraid of the things that your science couldn't explain." "That's not true," Julian whispered. "It is true," Omar said, stepping closer. "I smelled it on you the first day. The fear underneath the arrogance. The doubt beneath the certainty. You were a feast waiting to happen, Julian, and now you will help me prepare the next feast." "I won't," Julian said, backing away. "I won't spread your fear. I won't become your herald." "You will," Omar said, and his shadow was moving now, detaching from his body, spreading across the ground like a pool of spilled ink. "Because the alternative is so much worse. The alternative is the hollow, the place where I take those who refuse me. The place where they are consumed slowly over centuries, their souls eaten one bite at a time. You don't want that, Julian. No one wants that." Julian turned and ran. He ran through the village, past the dark houses, past the dying embers of the fire, toward the beach and the ocean beyond. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, until he reached the water's edge and could run no further. Behind him he heard Omar, the Popobawa, following. Not running, not hurrying, but walking with terrible patience, knowing that Julian had nowhere to go, no way to escape, no hope of salvation. "You can run to the water," Omar's voice came, echoing strangely in the night air. "But you can't run from what you carry inside you. You are marked, Julian. You are mine. And soon, very soon, you will do what I require." Julian fell to his knees in the sand, the warm water of the Indian Ocean lapping at his legs. He could feel the thing inside him now, the presence that the Popobawa had planted during the attack, the seed of fear that was growing, spreading, consuming his thoughts from within. "What do you want?" he screamed into the night. "What do you want from me?" "I want what I have always wanted," Omar said, standing over him now, his shadow covering Julian like a blanket. "I want the village to burn with fear. I want the people to turn against each other, to suspect their neighbors, to see monsters in their loved ones. I want the mass hysteria that feeds me, that sustains me, that makes me strong. And you, Julian, you arrogant man of science, you will give it to me." "How?" Julian asked, defeated. "By telling them," Omar said, kneeling beside him, his breath hot and sulphurous against Julian's face. "By warning them. By spreading the word that the Popobawa is here, that it has chosen you, that it will choose others. By becoming the voice of fear that they cannot ignore. And if I refuse, then I will show you what I really am," Omar said, and his face began to change, his features shifting, melting, reforming into something that was not human, not animal, but something else entirely. A single eye, large and yellow and filled with terrible intelligence. Wings that unfolded from his back, leathery and dark. A body that was both there and not there, solid and shadow, real and nightmare. Julian screamed again, and this time the scream carried no words, only the pure animal terror of a human mind confronted with something it was never meant to see. When the scream ended, when Julian's voice gave out and he collapsed onto the sand, the Popobawa was gone. Only Omar remained, human again, smiling gently down at him. "Tomorrow," Omar said, "you will begin. Tomorrow you will warn them, and I will feed." He walked away, his footsteps silent on the sand, leaving Julian alone on the beach with the waves and the moon and the shadow that now clung to his own body, the shadow that had wings. Julian lay there until dawn, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in his own terror. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he dragged himself back to his house and sat on the steps, waiting for the village to wake. He knew what he had to do. The choice was no choice at all. And somewhere in the shadows, the Popobawa was waiting, patient and hungry, for the feast to begin. The morning was false. That was the only way Julian could describe it. The sun was bright, the sky was blue, the ocean sparkled with the innocent beauty of a tropical paradise, and yet everything was tainted, everything was wrong, everything was covered with an invisible film of sulfur and shadow. He sat on the steps of his house, watching the village wake. The first to emerge were the fishermen, their boats waiting on the beach, their nets ready. They moved quietly, efficiently, their eyes avoiding Julian's, their bodies turning slightly away as they passed. They knew. They had always known. The morning after an attack, the victim was marked, dangerous, contagious. They gave him wide berth, as if the thing that had touched him could be transmitted like a disease. Omar appeared an hour later, strolling down the street with the casual grace of a man who had all the time in the world. He looked completely human, completely normal, the charming guide who had befriended Julian 3 weeks ago, before the attack, before the revelation, before the world had fallen apart. "Good morning, Julian," Omar said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Did you sleep well?" Julian stared at him, trying to see the creature beneath the mask. But there was nothing to see, only the handsome face, the warm smile, the intelligent eyes. The Popobawa hid itself well. "What are you?" Julian asked, his voice rough from screaming. "Really, not the folklore, not the stories. What are you actually?" Omar sat on the step beside him, his shadow falling across Julian's legs. I am old, Julian, older than your species, older than the islands. I came here when the world was young, when the volcanoes that formed these islands were still active, when the earth breathed sulfur and fire. I am a thing of the deep places, the dark places, the spaces between what humans can see and what they imagine. You're a demon. Omar laughed, a sound that was genuinely amused. Demon is your word, not mine. I am simply what I am, a consumer of fear, a cultivator of terror. I feed on the emotional energy of humans, specifically on the mass hysteria that spreads when communities turn against themselves. I don't kill, Julian, not usually. Killing is wasteful. I consume the mind, not the body. I hollow out the victim and wear them like a mask. And Omar, was he a real person? The smile faltered just for a moment, and Julian saw something beneath it, sorrow perhaps, or boredom, or simply the weariness of age. Omar was real. Once. He walked these beaches, breathed this air, lived this life. And then he became my vessel, my mask, my way of moving among you without causing panic. I have worn many faces over the centuries, Julian. Omar is just the latest. What happened to him, the real Omar? He lives inside me, the creature said. He sees what I see, knows what I know. He is part of my memory now, part of my collection. When I am done with this face, I will find another. Perhaps I will find yours. Julian shuddered, unable to control the revulsion that coursed through him. Why me? Why not one of the villagers? They believe in you already. They fear you already. Why choose an outsider, someone who doesn't believe? Because you are perfect, Omar said, standing up, brushing sand from his clothes. You are arrogant and afraid, certain and doubtful, rational and superstitious. You embody the contradictions that make the best vessels. And because you are connected to the outside world, to the cities and the nations and the networks of information. Through you, I can spread beyond these islands. I can reach the mainland, the continents, the places where humans crowd together in their millions, creating vast fields of fear ready for harvest. I won't do it, Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. You will, Omar said, not unkindly, because the alternative is worse. You have until sunset, Julian, then you will begin, or you will end. He walked away, disappearing around a corner, leaving Julian alone with his impossible choice. The villagers were already gathering in the square when Julian finally rose from the steps. The fire had been rebuilt, roaring high despite the morning heat, and people were arranging their sleeping mats around it, preparing for another day of vigil. Children played in the sand, their laughter sounding strange and fragile in the heavy air. Women prepared food over smaller fires, their eyes darting constantly to the shadows, to the edges of the clearing, to the places where darkness lingered. Julian approached slowly, feeling their attention turn to him like a physical weight. He was the outsider, the marked one, the vessel. They knew what he carried. They could smell it on him, the sulfur and the shadow, the taint of the Popobawa. Mwalimu Kamis, the village elder, met him at the edge of the square. He was an old man, his face carved with lines that spoke of decades of sun and wind and worry. His eyes were kind but wary, the eyes of a man who had seen too much to dismiss anything as mere superstition. You have been chosen, Kamis said. It was not a question. Yes, Julian admitted. And you have come to warn us. Julian stopped, the words catching in his throat. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to spread fear to trigger the hysteria that the creature craved. But he remembered Omar's words, remembered the glimpse of the true form beneath the mask, remembered the single yellow eye and the leathery wings. I have come to tell you that the Popobawa is here. It has been here for weeks. It walks among us, wearing familiar faces. It has already taken victims. It will take more. A murmur ran through the crowd, fear spreading like ripples in water. Julian could feel it, almost taste it, the sudden spike of terror that lifted from the assembled villagers like steam from hot stone. The fire seemed to burn brighter in response, fed by the emotional energy that the creature consumed. Who has it taken? Someone shouted. Who walks among us? Who is the vessel? The questions came fast, desperate, panic already beginning to rise. Julian raised his hands, trying to calm them, but his own fear was too great, his own trauma too fresh. He could feel the Popobawa feeding already, drawing sustenance from the collective terror that was building. I don't know who else, Julian said. I only know that it came to me 9 nights ago. It entered my house, my bed, my body. It marked me. It made me its herald. Then you are the danger, a woman screamed, pointing at him with a trembling finger. You bring it to us. You are the source. I am not the source, Julian said, his voice rising. I am the warning. The source is here among us, wearing a face you trust. It could be anyone. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your family. You must be vigilant. You must watch the shadows. You must never sleep alone. The panic was building now, the fear feeding on itself, growing stronger with every word. Julian could feel the Popobawa's pleasure, a distant sensation like warm water rising around him, like being submerged in something thick and sweet. The creature was here, in the square, feeding even now. How do we stop it? Commies asked, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. Julian hesitated. He didn't know how to stop it. The creature had not told him that. It had only demanded that he spread fear, not that he provide solutions. Fire, he said finally, remembering the nightly bonfires, the way the villagers never let the flames die. It fears fire, light, the brightness that banishes shadow. Keep the fires burning, never sleep in darkness, never be alone. And you, commies asked, what do we do with you? Julian looked at the faces around him, the fear that was already turning to suspicion, to accusation, to the madness that would tear the village apart. He had done exactly what the creature wanted. He had planted the seed, and now it would grow, consuming everything in its path. I will leave, Julian said. I will try to leave. Maybe if I am gone, the fear will diminish. Maybe the creature will follow me. Or maybe it will stay, Kami said. Maybe you are the lure, not the prey. Maybe by leaving, you only spread it further. Julian had no answer. He turned and walked away, back to his house, back to the sanctuary that was no sanctuary at all. Behind him, the voices rose in argument, in accusation, in the building hysteria that would soon consume the entire village. He had done this. He had fed the beast, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The day passed in a haze of dread. Julian sat in his house, listening to the sounds from the square. The arguments grew louder, then died down, then rose again. He heard accusations, denials, the breaking of trust as neighbors turned against neighbors, as friends became suspects, as families fractured under the weight of fear. By midday, the first violence broke out. 2 men fighting over a suspected glance, a shadow seen from the corner of an eye. By afternoon, 3 families had packed their belongings and fled, seeking refuge in neighboring villages, carrying the fear with them like a contagion. The Popobawa was feeding well today. Julian could feel it, the distant sensation of satisfaction that was not his own. The creature was pleased. The vessel was performing as expected. The harvest was beginning. He knew he should run, take his chances on the water, try to reach the mainland, escape to some place where the creature could not find him. But he was exhausted, drained, his body still recovering from the pumice stone scrubbing, his mind shattered by days of terror. He lay on his bed, not sleeping. He couldn't sleep, not anymore, not after the attack, but drifting in a state between waking and nightmare. When the sun began to set, he forced himself up. He had to see what his words had wrought. He had to witness the consequences of his choice. The square was transformed. Where there had been order, there was now chaos. The fire still burned, fed constantly by volunteers who dared not let it die, but the people around it were no longer a community. They were isolated islands of fear, each one suspicious of the others, each one watching for signs of the creature in every shadow. Julian saw a child crying, separated from her mother, both of them too afraid to approach each other. He saw old friends standing apart, their eyes meeting then darting away, the trust between them shattered. He saw the village that had been, the peaceful community he had come to modernize, destroyed by the very thing he had dismissed as superstition. Omar, the Popobawa, stood at the edge of the square, watching the destruction with a smile that was almost tender. When he saw Julian, he walked over, putting an arm around his shoulders in a gesture of false friendship. "You have done well," the creature said. "Look at them, look at the feast you have provided." "I hate you," Julian whispered. "I know," Omar said, "but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you served me, and now you will serve me again." "No, I won't spread more fear. I won't make it worse." "You won't have to," Omar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tonight I will reveal myself. Tonight I will show them what they fear. And then, Julian, then the real feast begins." He stepped away, his shadow stretching long in the setting sun, and Julian saw that the shadow was already changing, already taking on the shapes of wings and claws and terrible beauty. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood. The villagers huddled around the fire, their faces pale in the flickering light. They were waiting for something, though they didn't know what. Waiting for the night to fall, for the darkness to complete its victory, for the thing that lived in shadows to claim its due. And as the last light faded, as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the Popobawa began to transform. It happened slowly at first, so slowly that many didn't notice. Omar stood at the edge of the firelight, his features softening, shifting, rearranging themselves into something that was not quite human. His body elongated, his arms stretching, his legs bending in ways that violated anatomy. The shadow that clung to him grew larger, spreading across the ground like a pool of spilled ink. Then the wings emerged. They unfolded from his back with the sound of wet leather stretching wide, blocking out the stars. The villagers screamed, scrambling backward, trying to escape, but the wings cast shadows everywhere, filling every corner of the square with darkness. The face was last to change. Omar's handsome features melted away, revealing what lay beneath: the single yellow eye, the wide mouth filled with teeth like broken glass, the skin that was both there and not there, solid and shadow, real and nightmare. "I am here," the Popobawa said, and its voice was the grinding of stones, the breaking of waves, the voice of the deep earth. "I have always been here. I will always be here. And you, all of you, you are mine." The panic became absolute. The villagers fled in every direction, but the shadows were everywhere, and in the shadows the creature was everywhere. It did not pursue them directly. It didn't need to. It simply existed, filling the darkness, feeding on the terror that it had cultivated. Julian stood frozen, watching the destruction he had enabled. The Popobawa turned to him, its single eye fixing on him with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been hunger. "You have served me well," it said, "and now you will serve me forever." It reached for him its hand. If it was a hand, extending, touching Julian's chest with a weight that crushed the breath from his lungs. Julian screamed, and the scream joined the screams of the village, and the screams fed the creature, and the feeding continued long into the night. Julian woke to darkness absolute, not the darkness of night, which always contained some light, starlight, moonlight, the glow of distant fires, but a deeper darkness, a total absence of illumination that seemed to exist not as the absence of light, but as the presence of something else entirely. He could not see, he could not feel his body. He existed only as thought, as consciousness, floating in a void without dimension or direction. "You are inside me now," the voice said, and it came from everywhere and nowhere, from within Julian's own mind and from outside it, from the darkness itself. "This is the hollow, Julian. This is where I keep my collection." "What have you done to me?" Julian tried to speak, but he had no mouth, no voice, only the intention of words that somehow manifested as sound in the void. I have consumed you, the Popobawa said. Not your body that still exists somewhere lying in the square where you fell, but your essence, your consciousness, your memories and thoughts and fears. I have taken them into myself, made them part of my collection, my museum of human experience. Julian tried to remember what had happened. The transformation in the square, the emergence of the creature's true form, the reaching hand, the crushing weight. Then darkness. Then this. Why, he asked, why keep me conscious? Why not just destroy me? Because destruction is wasteful, the creature said, and its voice was almost gentle, almost sad. I am a collector, Julian, a curator. I preserve the minds I consume, keep them intact, allow them to continue experiencing existence even after their bodies have failed. You will live forever in here, Julian. Forever in the hollow. Forever, Julian repeated, and the word was terrible in its implications. Time moves differently here, the Popobawa explained. What seems like centuries to you might be only moments in the outside world. You will experience everything I experience, see everything I see, know everything I know. You will be part of my consciousness, my memory, my being. And in return, you will feed me. Your fear, your terror, your despair. They will sustain me, make me stronger, allow me to continue my work. Your work, Julian said, his non-existent voice bitter. Spreading fear, destroying communities, wearing people's faces like masks. I do not destroy, the creature corrected. I transform, I elevate. I take the mundane existence of humans and give it meaning, give it purpose, give it the sharp edge of terror that makes life worth living. Without fear, Julian, there is no courage. Without darkness, no light. I am the contrast that makes your existence meaningful. You're a parasite, Julian said, a monster, a thing that feeds on suffering. I am what I am, the Popobawa said, and there was finality in the words. And now you are part of what I am. Welcome to eternity, Julian. Then there was silence, and the darkness deepened, and Julian was alone with his thoughts in a void that had no end. But he was not alone for long. Gradually, impressions began to reach him, other consciousnesses, other minds, other victims who had been consumed before him. He sensed them as presences in the darkness, distinct from himself yet part of the same whole, individual notes in a symphony of despair. You are new, a voice said, female, young, frightened. How long ago did you come? I don't know, Julian said. I can't feel time. None of us can, another voice said, older, male, exhausted. Time is different here. I have been here for, I don't know, decades, centuries. It feels like forever. Who are you? Julian asked. All of you, who were you? I was a teacher, the female voice said, in a village on the mainland. The Popobawa came to me 20 years ago, maybe more. I don't remember exactly. I was a fisherman, the male voice said, caught in a storm, washed up on these shores. That was centuries ago, I think, before the Arabs came, before the Portuguese, when the island was still wild. And there are others, Julian asked. Hundreds, the female voice said. Thousands, maybe. I don't know. We can't see each other, only sense each other. The Popobawa has been feeding for a very long time. Julian tried to process this. Thousands of minds, trapped in darkness, feeding the creature with their terror, sustaining it for centuries or millennia. The scale of the horror was beyond comprehension. Is there no escape? He asked. No way out? None that we have found, the fisherman said. We have tried everything, screaming into the darkness, trying to find boundaries, trying to wake up. Nothing works. We are here until the creature decides to release us. And has it ever released anyone? Silence, then finally, no, not in all the time I have been here, not ever. Julian felt despair settle over him like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. He had thought his fate was terrible, to be marked, to be used as a vessel to spread fear. But this was worse. This was unending, eternal, a prison of consciousness with no walls and no doors. There must be something, he said, some weakness, some way to fight. We have tried, the teacher said. We have tried everything. The creature has no weakness that we can find. It is ancient, powerful, beyond our understanding. But it feeds on fear, Julian said, thinking. That's what the creature told me. It needs fear to survive, to grow. What if we stopped fearing? What if we— It doesn't work like that, the fisherman interrupted. You can't choose not to fear, not in here. The darkness itself is fear. The isolation is fear. The eternity is fear. It surrounds us, fills us, becomes us. We are fear now. We are the food. But I am still myself, Julian said. I still have my thoughts, my memories, my identity. I haven't been absorbed completely. I am still Julian Barrington. For now, the teacher said, but that will change. Slowly, over time, we lose ourselves. The boundaries blur. We become part of the whole, part of the creature, indistinguishable from its own consciousness. It is a kind of death, Julian, a death of self. The only mercy is that it takes a very long time. How long? Julian asked. For me, decades, and I am still mostly myself, the teacher said. For him, centuries, and he is still partly himself. But eventually we all fade. Eventually we all become simply part of the Popobawa. Julian felt a strange calm settle over him. If there was no escape, if the only end was dissolution into the creature's consciousness, then he had nothing to lose by fighting. He could try things that the others hadn't tried, push boundaries that hadn't been pushed, test the limits of his prison. I am going to resist, he said. I am going to hold on to who I am. I am going to remember everything, my name, my past, my humanity, and I am going to find a way out. Good luck, the fisherman said, and his voice was sad, resigned. Many have tried, none have succeeded. Then I will be the first, Julian said. He turned his attention inward, focusing on his own consciousness, trying to map the boundaries of his prison. He had no body, but he had thought, and thought required space, required some dimension in which to exist. He began to explore that space, pushing outward, seeking walls, seeking limits, seeking any structure that he could understand. Time passed, or perhaps it didn't. In the void, Julian couldn't tell. He continued his exploration, finding nothing, no boundaries, no edges, only endless darkness. But he refused to despair. He refused to feed the creature with his fear. Instead, he remembered. He reconstructed his life in exhaustive detail, his childhood in London, his education, his work, his relationships, his arrival on Unguja. He replayed every conversation, every meal, every moment of his existence, building a fortress of memory around his consciousness, a bulwark against the dissolution that the others had described. And as he remembered, he began to notice something. The Popobawa was always there, always listening, always feeding. But it was not omniscient. It could not see everything inside its own consciousness. There were gaps, blind spots, spaces where Julian's thoughts were shielded from its perception. He tested this carefully, cautiously. He thought about things that might anger the creature, might challenge it, might threaten it, and he watched for reactions. Nothing. The creature either didn't notice or didn't care. He pushed further. He began to explore not just his own memories but the memories of the creature itself. The Popobawa's consciousness was vast, ancient, filled with experiences spanning millennia. Julian touched these memories tentatively, like a blind man feeling an elephant, trying to understand the shape of something too large to comprehend. He saw the island's formation, volcanic eruptions from the depths of the earth, the birth of the archipelago in fire and sulfur. He saw the first humans arriving, fishing boats from the mainland, explorers and traders and settlers. He saw centuries of history, civilizations rising and falling, the coming of Islam, the Portuguese, the Omani Arabs, the British. And he saw himself, saw the creature wearing Omar's face, approaching him, befriending him, planning his consumption. Saw the attack, the violation, the marking. Saw himself spreading fear in the square, triggering the hysteria, becoming the vessel the creature had intended. He saw more. Saw other victims, other villages, other centuries. The Popobawa had fed on Unguja for thousands of years, moving from community to community, wearing different faces, spreading different fears. Sometimes it was active, consuming victims openly. Sometimes it was dormant, waiting for conditions to favor its emergence. And Julian saw something else, a pattern, a weakness. The Popobawa fed on mass hysteria, on collective fear, on communities turning against themselves. But when the fear became too great, when the panic reached a certain threshold, something happened. The creature would retreat, go dormant, disappear for years or decades until the memory faded and a new generation grew up without knowing the terror. It couldn't sustain the feast indefinitely. It needed the ebb and flow, the rise and fall, the contrast between fear and peace. If the fear became constant, unending, it lost its flavor, became stale, lost its power to sustain the creature. "I understand," Julian said aloud into the void. "Understand what?" the teacher asked, her voice faint, distant. "The creature's weakness. It needs variation. It needs the cycle. Fear followed by peace, panic followed by calm. If we deny it that cycle." "How?" the fisherman asked. "We are trapped here. We have no power over the outside world." "But we have power here," Julian said. "We are part of its consciousness. We can affect it from within. If we all stop fearing all at once, if we all choose calm instead of terror." "It's impossible," the teacher said. "You can't choose your emotions, not here." "But we can choose our thoughts," Julian said. "We can choose what to focus on, what to remember, what to imagine. The creature feeds on the emotional energy we produce. But what if we produce something else? What if we produce indifference?" "Indifference?" "Complete, total indifference," Julian said. "Not fear, not courage, not hope, not despair. Simply nothing, the absence of emotional reaction, a void within the void." The others were silent for a long moment. Then the fisherman spoke. "It's worth trying. We have nothing to lose." "But how do we spread it?" the teacher asked. "How do we reach the others, the thousands of others trapped here?" "I have been exploring the creature's consciousness," Julian said. "I can sense the others now, all of them, scattered through the darkness. If I concentrate, I can reach them, speak to them, share this idea." "Then do it," the fisherman said. "Quickly, before the creature notices what you're doing." Julian reached out, extending his consciousness through the void, touching the minds of the other victims. He found them, thousands upon thousands, scattered like stars in a dark sky, each one isolated, each one feeding the creature with their individual terror. He spoke to them, not with words but with concepts, with images, with the idea of indifference as resistance. He showed them what he had learned, the creature's weakness, the possibility of escape through apathy. Some rejected him immediately, too lost in their fear to consider another way. Others listened, considered, hesitated. And some, enough perhaps, embraced the idea. Indifference, they thought together, thousands of minds joining in a single intention. We choose indifference. We choose not to care. We choose not to feel. The effect was immediate. Julian felt it as a shift in the darkness, a change in the quality of the void. The fear that had permeated everything, that had been the only constant, began to fade. It was replaced by nothing, emptiness, void. "What are you doing?" The Popobawa's voice thundered, suddenly present, suddenly angry. "Stop this! You cannot resist me." "We are not resisting," Julian said, his voice calm, his mind empty. "We are simply not feeling, we are not afraid, we are not anything." "You cannot choose not to feel," the creature screamed. "I am inside you, I know your thoughts, I feel your emotions." "Do you?" Julian asked. "Do you feel anything now?" The silence that followed was profound. The creature was searching, Julian knew, scanning its own consciousness for the fear that sustained it, finding only emptiness. "This is impossible," the Popobawa whispered. "This has never happened." "There is a first time for everything," Julian said, "even for you." The darkness began to shift, to change. Julian felt pressure building. the creature trying to force them to feel, to fear, to feed it. But they resisted, thousands of minds united in emptiness, refusing to give the creature what it needed. "You will die," the Popobawa said. "Without my sustenance, without the energy I provide, your consciousness will fade. You will cease to exist." "Perhaps," Julian said, "but so will you, or at least you will be diminished. You will lose your collection, your museum, your food source. Is that worth our destruction?" "I am eternal," the creature said, but its voice was weaker now, uncertain. "I have survived worse." "Have you?" Julian asked. "Have you ever faced complete indifference, complete apathy? Has any victim ever refused to fear you, even in death?" Silence. "I thought not," Julian said. "We have found your weakness, creature, and now we are going to use it." He reached out again, touching more minds, spreading the concept of indifference like a virus through the creature's consciousness. More and more victims joined them, choosing emptiness over terror, void over fear. The Popobawa screamed, a sound that shook the foundations of the void, and the darkness began to tear. "You are destroying me," the creature howled. "You are killing me." "No," Julian said. "We are simply choosing not to sustain you. There is a difference." The tearing continued, the void fracturing, light beginning to penetrate the darkness. Julian felt something pulling at him, something outside the creature's consciousness, something calling him back to his body, to the world, to life. "Go," he said to the others. "All of you, escape while you can." "What about you?" the teacher asked. "I will hold the line," Julian said. "I will keep the creature occupied while you flee. Someone has to be last." "You will be trapped here forever," the fisherman said. "Perhaps," Julian said, "but at least I will have one. At least I will have beaten it. That is worth any price." He felt them leaving, thousands of minds streaming past him, escaping through the tears in the void, returning to their bodies or to whatever afterlife awaited them. The Popobawa screamed and raged, but it was powerless to stop them, its strength fading with every victim that escaped. "I will destroy you," the creature hissed at Julian. "I will keep you here forever, torturing you, making you feel everything you have denied me." "Perhaps," Julian said again, "but you will never feed on me again. You will never use me to spread fear. You will never wear my face. That is my victory, creature. That is my triumph." The light grew stronger, the void fading, the creature's consciousness unraveling around him. Julian felt himself being pulled, drawn toward the light, toward escape, toward freedom. "No," the Popobawa screamed. "You cannot leave. You are mine. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," Julian said. And then he let go, surrendering to the light, allowing himself to be pulled out of the darkness and back into the world. He woke on the beach, the sun rising over the Indian Ocean, his body whole and unmarked. He lay there for a long time, feeling the sand beneath him, the salt air in his lungs, the warmth of the sun on his skin. He was alive, he was free, and he was not afraid. He sat up and looked at the village. It was quiet, peaceful, the terror of the night before seemingly forgotten. The villagers were emerging from their homes, going about their business, living their lives. The Popobawa was gone. Not destroyed, perhaps, but diminished, weakened, forced to retreat. It would be back, Julian knew. It was ancient and patient, and it would wait for another opportunity, another victim, another chance to feed. But Julian would be ready. He would spread the knowledge, teach others what he had learned, help them understand that the creature's power lay in fear and could be defeated through indifference. He stood up, brushed the sand from his clothes, and walked toward the village, toward the future, toward whatever came next. The Popobawa was still inside him, he realized. Not in control, not dominant, but present, a shadow on his soul, a weight on his spirit. He could feel it watching, waiting, patient as eternity. But he was not afraid. And as long as he was not afraid, the creature could not feed. As long as he was not afraid, he was free. He reached the edge of the village and stopped, looking back at the ocean. The sun was fully risen now, painting the sky in gold and pink, turning the water into a sheet of beaten copper. "I see you," Julian said to the shadow inside him. "I know you're there, and I don't care." The shadow stirred, shifted, settled. It knew somehow that Julian meant it, that he had found the weapon that could defeat it, not fire, not light, not courage, but simple, total, absolute indifference. "You will fear again," the creature whispered, its voice faint, distant, a memory of a memory. "Perhaps," Julian said. "Someday, but not today. Today I am free, and that is enough." He turned and walked into the village, into the light, into the future. The Popobawa followed, as it always would, a shadow clinging to his soul. But Julian paid it no mind. He had learned the secret, found the weakness, won the battle. The war would continue. The creature would hunt again, feed again, consume again. But Julian would be ready. He would teach others what he knew, spread the knowledge, build a resistance against the fear. He was Julian Barrington, urban planner, survivor, victor, and he was not afraid. The sun rose higher, burning away the last of the shadows, and Julian Barrington walked into the light, ready to face whatever came next. 6 months after his escape from the Popobawa's consciousness, Julian Barrington stood on the deck of a cargo ship bound for Mombasa, watching the island of Unguja recede into the distance. He was a changed man, changed in ways that were visible and invisible, ways that he was only beginning to understand. He had spent the months since the encounter working with the villagers, helping them rebuild their community, their trust, their sense of security. The mass hysteria had faded slowly, replaced by a wary peace, a cautious return to normalcy. The Popobawa had not returned, had not shown itself, had not fed. The creature was wounded, diminished, recovering from the psychic blow that Julian and the other victims had dealt it. But it was not gone. Julian knew this with a certainty that never left him. The creature was still there, still present, still waiting. It existed now in a state of dormancy, licking its wounds, gathering its strength, preparing for the next cycle of fear. And Julian was still connected to it, still carrying a piece of it inside him, a shadow that clung to his soul. He could feel it sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, a presence, a weight, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. The Popobawa watching him, studying him, learning from its defeat. It had never encountered indifference before, had never faced a victim who refused to fear. It was adapting, evolving, developing new strategies for the next encounter. Julian had spent the months studying, researching, trying to understand what he had faced. He had delved into the anthropology of Zanzibar, the history of the archipelago, the folklore of the Swahili coast. He had learned that the Popobawa was not unique to Unguja, that similar entities existed in coastal communities throughout East Africa, that the fear of such creatures was woven into the cultural fabric of the region. He had also learned that the creatures were cyclical. They fed for years or decades, then went dormant for generations, then returned when the conditions were right. The Popobawa's last major feeding cycle had been in the 1990s, before Julian's arrival. The current cycle had been triggered, he suspected, by the stresses of modernization, by the clash between traditional culture and outside influence, by the anxieties that his very presence had exacerbated. He had become, without intending it, an anthropologist of fear. He understood now that the Popobawa was not merely a monster but a manifestation of something deeper, the collective unconscious of a people, the repository of their anxieties and traumas, the externalization of their internal struggles. The creature fed on fear because fear was its substance, its reality, its reason for existence. And he understood something else, something that frightened him more than the creature itself. The Popobawa was not the only one of its kind. Similar entities existed in every culture, every society, every human community. They were the shadows that walked among us, the fears that took on independent existence, the manifestations of our collective nightmares. The cargo ship was a working vessel, not a cruise liner, and Julian had taken passage as a deckhand, trading labor for transport. He needed to leave Unguja, needed to put distance between himself and the creature, needed to find a place where the shadow inside him could not grow. But he also needed to stay connected, to remain vigilant, to be ready when the creature emerged again. The other deckhands avoided him, sensing something in his bearing, his silence, his haunted eyes. They whispered about him in Swahili, speculating about his past, his crime, his curse. Julian ignored them. He had learned to live with isolation, to find comfort in solitude, to cultivate the indifference that was his only defense against the creature. On the third day of the voyage, the shadow spoke to him. It was midday, the sun high and hot, the ocean a sheet of beaten bronze stretching to every horizon. Julian was coiling rope on the aft deck, his body moving automatically, his mind drifting in the meditative state that he had cultivated over months of practice. "You are running," the voice said, and it came from inside him, from the shadow that he carried, from the piece of the Popobawa that had not been expelled. "I am leaving," Julian corrected, not speaking aloud but thinking the words clearly, projecting them into the space where the creature could hear. "There is a difference." "There is no difference," the voice said, and it was Omar's voice, the voice of the mask the creature had worn, the voice that had befriended him and betrayed him. "You are fleeing from me. You are afraid." "I am not afraid," Julian said, and it was true or true enough. He felt no fear, only a wary alertness, a readiness, a calm that came from knowing the worst and surviving it. "You should be," the voice said. "I am healing. I am growing stronger. Soon I will be whole again, and then I will come for you." "You will try," Julian said, "and I will resist." "You cannot resist forever," the voice said. "Indifference is difficult. It requires constant vigilance. Eventually you will feel something. Eventually you will fear again. And when you do, I will be there." Julian stopped coiling the rope and stood still, looking out at the endless ocean. The creature was right. Indifference was hard. It required constant effort, a perpetual suppression of emotional reaction. Fear was natural, automatic, effortless. To not fear took work. But he had been practicing. For 6 months, he had cultivated emptiness, trained himself to observe without reacting, to experience without feeling. He had become, in a sense, like the creature itself, a thing that fed on the absence of emotion, that sustained itself through apathy. "You are becoming like me," the voice said, as if reading his thoughts. "That is the irony. To defeat me, you must become me. You must shed your humanity, your emotion, your connection to the world. You must become a void, an emptiness, a shadow." "I am not like you," Julian said. "I choose my emptiness. You have no choice. You are empty by nature. I am empty by decision." "Is there a difference?" the voice asked. "There is a difference," Julian said, "and that difference is everything." He resumed his work, coiling the rope with mechanical precision, his mind returning to the meditative state that kept the creature at bay. The voice faded, retreating into the depths of his consciousness, but Julian knew it was still there, still waiting, still patient. The voyage took 7 days. 7 days of labor, of meditation, of silent struggle against the shadow inside him. 7 days of preparing for whatever came next. They reached Mombasa on a Tuesday morning, the ship sliding into the harbor with the low rumble of engines and the creak of ropes. Julian collected his small bag of belongings, the clothes on his back, the notebooks he had filled with observations and theories, the leather journal that contained his thoughts on the nature of fear, and disembarked, stepping onto the dock with a sense of relief that he refused to feel fully. Mombasa was a city, a real city, with noise and traffic and crowds of people going about their lives. It was also, Julian knew, a city with its own shadows, its own fears, its own manifestations of collective anxiety. The Popobawa was not unique to Unguja. Similar creatures existed here, in the shadows of alleyways, in the spaces between buildings, in the blind spots of human perception. But the creature that rode inside him was specific, individual, tied to the island and the experiences they had shared. It would be weaker here, away from its home territory, away from the feeding grounds it had cultivated for centuries. Julian would be stronger here, more himself, more human. He found a cheap hotel near the waterfront, a place with thin walls and a broken air conditioner, and a view of the harbor that reminded him of Unguja. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the shadow stir within him. "This is not your place," the voice said. "This is not your territory. You are vulnerable here." "I am strong here," Julian corrected. "I am away from you, away from your power." "I am inside you," the voice said. "I am always with you. Distance means nothing. Territory means nothing. I am part of you now." "A small part," Julian said. "A shadow, a memory, not the whole." "For now," the voice agreed. "But shadows grow, memories strengthen. I will not always be small." "Then I will grow stronger too," Julian said. "I will learn, I will prepare, I will be ready." "You cannot prepare for what I will become," the voice said. "You cannot imagine the forms I will take, the strategies I will develop. I am ancient, Julian. I have survived worse than you. I have adapted to conditions that would destroy your kind." "And I am new," Julian said. "I am learning, I am adapting too. That is my advantage." Silence. Then finally, "You are interesting, Julian Barrington. You are not like the others, not like the villagers who fear and the outsiders who dismiss. You are something new, something dangerous." "I am human," Julian said. "That is enough." "Perhaps," the voice said, "perhaps that is enough, we shall see." Then it was gone, retreating into the depths of his consciousness, leaving Julian alone with his thoughts. He lay on the bed for hours, thinking, planning, preparing. He knew now that he could not run forever. The creature was inside him, would always be inside him, would always be waiting for him to feel, to fear, to feed it. He needed a different strategy, not indifference, which was exhausting and unsustainable, not fear, which would only strengthen the creature, something else, something new. He thought of the villagers on Unguja, the way they had rebuilt their community after the hysteria. He thought of their strength, their resilience, their capacity to endure. He thought of the fire in the square, the nightly vigil, the collective defense against the darkness. Community, that was the answer, not isolation, not emptiness, but connection. The Popobawa fed on fear, yes, but it also fed on isolation, on individual vulnerability, on the breakdown of trust. In community, in connection, in shared strength, there was a defense. He needed to find others, others who had faced the creature, who understood its nature, who had developed their own strategies for survival. He needed to build a network, a resistance, a movement. He opened his notebook and began to write, sketching out a plan, a mission, a purpose. He would find the others, the released victims from the void, the survivors of other encounters, the people who knew, who understood, who had seen the truth. He would gather them, teach them, prepare them. Together, they would face the Popobawa when it returned. Together, they would be stronger than fear. The shadow stirred within him, sensing his resolve, his hope, his determination. It hissed, it whispered, it threatened. But Julian ignored it. He had found his weapon, not indifference but connection, not emptiness but community. He wrote until late into the night, filling pages with his plans, his theories, his hopes. When he finally slept, he dreamed of fire, of light, of people standing together against the darkness. And in his dream, the shadow retreated, unable to exist in the warmth of human connection. He woke with the sunrise, his mind clear, his purpose strong. He had a mission now, a purpose, a reason to exist. He would find the others. He would build the resistance. He would prepare for the return. The Popobawa would come again. Of that Julian had no doubt, but when it came, he would be ready. They would be ready. The war against fear had begun. Julian packed his bag, checked out of the hotel, and walked into the city, into the crowd, into the community of humanity that was his only defense against the shadows. He was not alone. He would never be alone again. And the shadow inside him, though it still existed, was smaller now, weaker, less powerful. It could not feed on connection, could not grow in the light of community. It would always be there, a reminder of what he had faced, what he had survived. But it would not control him. It would not defeat him. Julian Barrington, urban planner, survivor, warrior against fear, walked into the future with his head high and his heart full. The Popobawa had chosen the wrong victim. It had created its own destroyer. And somewhere in the shadows, in the dark spaces between fear and hope, the ancient creature felt something it had never felt before. It felt doubt. And for the first time in 10,000 years, it was afraid. 5 years after his escape from the Popobawa, Julian Barrington stood before a gathering of 200 people in a conference hall in Nairobi, speaking about the nature of fear. He was a different man than the arrogant urban planner who had arrived on Unguja, different even than the traumatized survivor who had fled the island. He had become something else, something between prophet and scientist, a man who spoke of monsters with the authority of direct experience. Fear is a technology, he said, his voice projecting to the back of the room. Not just an emotion, not just a reaction, but a tool, a system, a way of controlling behavior. The entities we call demons, monsters, shadow creatures, they are users of this technology. They have evolved to weaponize fear, to cultivate it, to harvest it. He paused, looking at the faces before him. They were a mixed group, anthropologists and psychologists, theologians and biologists, survivors of encounters and researchers of the unexplained. Some believed him completely. Others were skeptical but open-minded. A few were simply curious, drawn by the controversy that surrounded his work. The Popobawa, he continued, is not unique. Similar entities exist in every culture, every society, every human community. They are manifestations of collective anxiety, externalizations of internal conflict, predators that feed on the emotional energy of their prey. And they are not supernatural. They are natural, part of the ecosystem, part of the world. A hand rose in the audience. Dr. Barrington, you speak of these creatures as if they were biological entities, but there is no scientific evidence, no physical remains, no genetic samples, no documented proof of their existence. How do you respond to the charge that you are simply describing psychological phenomena? I respond with a question, Julian said. Where is the line between psychological and physical, between mental and material? The Popobawa exists in both realms. It is a creature of thought that takes physical form. It is a being of shadow that casts a shadow. It is both real and unreal, present and absent, physical and mental. That is not science, the questioner said. That is mysticism. That is observation, Julian corrected. I have seen this creature, I have felt it. I have carried it inside me. I know what it is, what it does, how it feeds. And I know that the distinction between psychological and physical is a construct, a useful one but a construct nonetheless. He paused again, gathering his thoughts. Let me be more specific. The Popobawa exists in what I call the liminal space, the boundary between what we can perceive and what we can only imagine. It occupies the gap between conscious and unconscious, between waking and dreaming, between self and other. It is not entirely physical, not entirely mental, but something that participates in both. And how does one fight such a creature? Another voice asked. Not with weapons, Julian said. Not with science, not with religion, not with any traditional approach. The Popobawa feeds on fear, on panic, on hysteria. It grows stronger when we react emotionally. The only defense is indifference. A murmur ran through the crowd. Indifference, someone repeated. Apathy. Not apathy, Julian clarified. Not carelessness or disengagement, but emotional equilibrium, the absence of fear, the refusal to react. The Popobawa cannot feed on what is not there. If we do not fear, if we do not panic, if we maintain our calm, the creature starves. That seems difficult, someone said. It is difficult, Julian agreed. It requires training, discipline, practice. That is why I have established the foundation, to teach people how to resist fear, how to maintain emotional balance in the face of terror, how to starve the creatures that feed on our panic. He gestured to the banner behind him, the Barrington Foundation for Emotional Resilience, a non-profit organization, 5 years old now, dedicated to researching and teaching the psychology of fear resistance. We have trained over 1,000 people, Julian continued. People who have faced the Popobawa, who have encountered similar entities, who have survived and returned to tell their stories. We have developed techniques, meditation, cognitive reframing, community support, that enable people to resist the fear that these creatures depend on. And the creatures, someone asked, what has become of them? Julian was silent for a moment, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest, where he could still feel the shadow, still sense the presence of the Popobawa that rode within him. They are dormant, he said finally, weakened by our resistance. The mass hysteria that fed them has diminished. The fear has receded. They sleep now, waiting for conditions to favor their return. And when they return, we will be ready, Julian said. We are building a network of resistance, a community of resilience. When the creatures wake again, and they will wake again, we will be prepared. We will not fear. We will not panic. We will starve them, weaken them, drive them back into dormancy. You speak as if this is a war, someone observed. It is a war, Julian said. A war that has been fought for millennia, since before recorded history. A war between humanity and the things that feed on our fear. And we are only now beginning to understand it, to develop strategies, to fight back effectively. The conference continued, questions and answers, discussions and debates. Julian spoke for hours, sharing his knowledge, his experience, his vision of a world that understood the true nature of fear and had learned to resist it. But even as he spoke, even as he taught, he felt the shadow inside him stir. The Popobawa was not gone. It was never gone. It was waiting, patient, ancient, patient as the tides and the seasons. It would return. It always returned. That night Julian lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the creature's presence. It had grown stronger in recent months, he had noticed. The shadow was deeper, the weight heavier, the whisper clearer. You are preparing, the voice said, and it was the same voice it had always been, Omar's voice, the voice of friendship betrayed. Preparing for my return. I am preparing, Julian agreed, not speaking aloud but thinking clearly, projecting into the space where the creature could hear. Preparing to resist you, to defeat you, to end your feeding forever. You cannot defeat me, the voice said. I am eternal, I am part of you, part of everyone. The fear I feed on is human nature. It is what you are. You cannot eliminate it without eliminating yourself. Perhaps, Julian said, but we can diminish it, we can control it, we can choose not to feed you. For a time, the creature agreed. For a generation, perhaps two, but eventually you will die. Your foundation will fade. Your teachings will be forgotten, and I will return, stronger than before, feeding on the fear of those who have forgotten how to resist. Then we will teach them again, Julian said. Again and again, as many times as necessary. We will build institutions, traditions, cultures of resistance. We will make the knowledge permanent, ineradicable, part of what it means to be human. Ambitious, the voice said, and there was something almost like respect in its tone. You have grown, Julian Barrington. You were once so small, so afraid, so easy to consume. Now you are something else, something dangerous. I am human, Julian said. That is enough. Perhaps, the creature said, perhaps it is for now. Then it was gone, retreating into the depths of his consciousness, leaving Julian alone with his thoughts. He lay awake until dawn, thinking about the future, the war, the endless cycle of fear and resistance. The Popobawa was right about one thing: the struggle was eternal. The creatures would always exist, always hunger, always seek to feed on human fear. But humans would always resist. They would learn, adapt, evolve. They would develop new strategies, new defenses, new ways of maintaining their emotional equilibrium in the face of terror. The war would continue, but humanity would survive. They had survived for 100,000 years, facing predators and plagues and disasters beyond counting. They would survive this too. Julian rose with the sun, showered, dressed, prepared for another day of teaching, researching, building the resistance. He was not afraid. He would never be afraid again. The shadow inside him stirred, sensed his resolve, retreated. The creature knew, somehow, that it had met its match, that Julian Barrington was no longer prey. He was a warrior, a teacher, a leader in the war against fear. And he was winning. The conference ended, the attendees departing with new knowledge, new tools, new hope. Julian watched them go, feeling satisfaction that he refused to let become pride. He had done good work here. He had spread the knowledge, built the network, strengthened the resistance. But there was more to do. There was always more to do. He packed his bags, checked out of the hotel, and walked into the Nairobi morning. The city was alive around him, people going about their lives, unaware of the ancient things that watched from the shadows, waiting for their moment. But they would be ready. They were learning, they were adapting. Julian hailed a taxi, gave the driver the address of the airport, and sat back to watch the city pass by. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, a message from the foundation, an update from a field team, a report of unusual activity in the coastal regions of Kenya. Something was stirring, something old, something hungry. Julian smiled, a small, determined expression. Let it come, he thought. We are ready. The taxi carried him toward the airport, toward the next battle, toward the future. The war against fear would continue as it had always continued, as it always would. But humanity would prevail. Julian was certain of it. He had faced the worst and survived. He had learned the secret. He had found the strength. The Popobawa had chosen the wrong victim. And now, 5 years later, Julian Barrington was ready to finish what he had started. The shadow stirred inside him, sensing his resolve, his determination, his absolute refusal to fear. I see you, Julian thought, and the thought was clear and strong and utterly without terror. I know you're there, and I don't care. The creature hissed, retreated, went silent. Julian smiled again, looking out at the passing city, the living world, the future he was helping to build. The war was not over, but for the first time in 10,000 years, the shadows were afraid. And that was enough. That was victory. Julian Barrington, survivor, teacher, warrior against fear, rode into the future with his head high and his heart full. The Popobawa would return. Of that he had no doubt. But when it did, humanity would be ready. And the darkness would finally learn what it meant to face a species that had evolved beyond fear. The end was not near, but the beginning of the end had begun. And Julian Barrington was leading the charge. 20 years after the Nairobi conference, Julian Barrington sat in a wheelchair on the porch of his home on the coast of Maine, watching the Atlantic roll in, feeling the shadow inside him finally fading. He was old now, 83, his body worn out by decades of travel and teaching and war. But his mind was still sharp, still clear, still filled with the knowledge that had consumed his life. The Barrington Foundation had grown beyond anything he had imagined. What had begun as a small nonprofit in Nairobi was now a global organization, with offices in 30 countries, a staff of thousands, and a mission that had evolved from research into action. The foundation didn't just study fear anymore. It trained people to resist it, built communities to support that resistance, and developed technologies to detect and defend against the entities that fed on human terror. The Popobawa had not returned, not in the way that Julian had feared. There had been incidents, flare-ups, moments when the creature stirred and tested the boundaries of its dormancy. But each time, The network of resistance had been ready, deploying teams of trained specialists who could enter affected communities, establish emotional equilibrium, and starve the creature before it could gain a foothold. Other entities had emerged, other manifestations of collective fear that had tested the Foundation's methods. Each had been different, some fed on individual terror, others on mass panic. Some were localized to specific regions, others spread like plagues across continents. But all shared the same fundamental characteristic. They required fear to survive, and they withered when that fear was denied them. Julian had trained thousands of people personally, had written 12 books, had given countless lectures and interviews and presentations. He had become a figure of some controversy, dismissed by mainstream science as a crank, embraced by paranormal enthusiasts as a prophet, respected by those who had faced the entities and survived as a teacher and guide. He didn't care about the labels. He cared about the work, the mission, the endless war against the ancient things that would always be hungry. "Dr. Barrington," a voice from inside the house, "you have a visitor." Julian turned his wheelchair, moving slowly, feeling the weakness in his arms, the fatigue that never left him anymore. A young woman stood in the doorway, early 20s, with dark hair and intense eyes that reminded him of someone he had known long ago. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Aisha," she said. "Aisha Chen. My grandmother was Sarah Chen. You worked with her in Seattle." Julian felt a rush of memory. Sarah Chen, the park ranger who had survived the caves, who had helped him understand the nature of the entities, who had been one of the first to join his cause. She had died 15 years ago, but her legacy lived on in the Foundation, in her children and grandchildren who had continued the work. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft with memory, "she was one of the best, one of the bravest." "She spoke of you often," Aisha said. "At the end, she said you had changed everything, that without you we would still be in the dark, still afraid, still victims." "She changed things too," Julian said. "She was a pioneer, one of the first to face the entities and survive." "I've read your books," Aisha said. "All of them. I've studied at the Foundation. I've trained in the methods. And now," she hesitated, "now I want to continue the work, but I have questions, questions that only you can answer." "Sit," Julian said, gesturing to a chair. "Tell me what you want to know." Aisha sat, her movements precise and controlled, the bearing of someone who had been trained. "The entities," she said. "You describe them as manifestations of collective fear, as externalizations of human anxiety, but," she paused, gathering her thoughts, "but are they real, physically real, or are they just psychological?" Julian smiled, the same question that had been asked for 20 years. "Both," he said. "Neither. They exist in the liminal space, the boundary between physical and mental. They are real enough to kill, to consume, to destroy. But they are also insubstantial, ephemeral. They exist because we believe in them, fear them, give them power. So if we stopped believing, they would fade," Julian finished. "But we can't stop believing. The fear is too deep, too primal, too much a part of what we are. We can control it, manage it, resist it, but we can't eliminate it, not completely." "Then the war never ends," Aisha said. "No," Julian agreed. "The war never ends, but it can be managed, contained. The entities can be kept at bay, starved into dormancy, prevented from feeding on a large scale. We can live with them, coexist. That is the best we can hope for." "That seems hopeless," Aisha said. "Not hopeless," Julian corrected. "Realistic. We have survived for 100,000 years alongside predators and plagues and disasters. We have evolved to face threats, to adapt, to overcome. The entities are just another challenge, one we can manage, one we can survive." "But not defeat," Aisha said. "Not defeat," Julian agreed. "Not completely. They are part of the ecosystem, part of the world, as much as we are. To defeat them completely would require changing human nature, eliminating fear itself. And if we did that," he paused, considering, If we did that, we would no longer be human. Aisha was silent, processing this. Then what is the point? She asked finally. Why fight a war we can't win? Because the alternative is worse, Julian said. Because without resistance, the entities would consume us. They would feed on our fear until there was nothing left, until humanity was hollowed out, a species of empty vessels. We fight not to win, but to survive. Not to defeat, but to endure. That is not very inspiring, Aisha said. It is not meant to be inspiring, Julian said. It is meant to be true. The truth is often disappointing, but it is still the truth. They sat in silence for a while, watching the ocean, listening to the waves. Julian felt the shadow inside him stir, the Popobawa sensing his weakness, his age, his approaching death. It had been waiting for this moment, he knew. Waiting for him to falter, to fear, to feed it one last time. I am not afraid, he thought, projecting into the space where the creature could hear. I have never been afraid, and I will not start now. The shadow retreated, frustrated, denied. What will happen when you die? Aisha asked, as if sensing his internal conversation. To the foundation, to the work. It will continue, Julian said. There are thousands of us now, trained, prepared, committed. The work will go on without me. It must go on without me. I am just one man, one voice. The cause is larger than any individual. And the creature? Aisha asked. The one inside you, the Popobawa. It will be released, Julian said. When I die, it will be freed from its prison. It will seek a new host, a new victim, a new source of fear. Isn't that dangerous? Aisha asked. Shouldn't we prepare, defend against it? We should, Julian agreed. And we will. The Foundation has protocols. When I die, teams will be deployed. Communities will be warned. The creature will be contained, isolated, prevented from spreading. It may take a victim, one or two, but it will not feast. It will not grow. It will be managed. That seems cold, Aisha said, to accept that people will die. It is cold, Julian agreed. But it is necessary. The creature must feed on someone. Better that it feeds on a few, contained, than on many, uncontained. We have learned to manage the entities, to control their impact. That is the best we can do. Aisha nodded slowly, accepting this. You have given your life to this, she said. Your entire existence. I have, Julian agreed. And I would do it again. 1,000 times. The work matters. The survival of our species matters. What about your own survival? Aisha asked. Your own happiness. Julian smiled, a genuine expression that softened his aged features. I have been happy, he said. Not in the way that most people understand happiness. Not in joy or pleasure or contentment, but in purpose, in meaning, in knowing that what I do matters. That is a form of happiness, perhaps the only true form. I want to understand, Aisha said. I want to learn to continue the work. Then you will, Julian said. You already have. You are here. You are asking the right questions. You are thinking about the hard truths. That is the first step. They talked for hours, Julian sharing his knowledge, his experience, his vision of the future. Aisha listened, asked questions, absorbed everything. She was sharp, capable, committed. She would carry on the work. She would ensure that the Foundation continued, that the resistance endured. When she left, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Julian sat alone on the porch, feeling the shadow inside him, feeling his own mortality, feeling the approach of the end. You are dying, the voice said, the Popobawa speaking from within. Soon I will be free. Soon, Julian agreed. But not yet. And when you are free, you will find the world changed. You will find a species that knows how to resist you, that knows how to starve you, that has learned to live without fear. Impossible, the creature said. Fear is human nature. It cannot be eliminated. Not eliminated, Julian corrected. Managed, controlled, resisted. We have evolved, creature. We have grown. We are no longer the prey we once were. We shall see, the creature said. We shall, Julian agreed. He sat in the gathering dark, watching the stars emerge, feeling the weight of his years, the burden of his mission. He had done what he could. He had built something that would last. He had changed the world in small ways, in ways that mattered. The war would continue. The entities would always be hungry, but humanity would survive. That was enough. That was victory. Julian Barrington closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. Not afraid, never afraid, at peace with what he had done and what was to come. The shadow stirred, sensed his calm, his acceptance, his complete absence of fear. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Popobawa felt something it had never felt before. It felt respect. The legacy of Julian Barrington would endure. The foundation would continue. The war would go on. But the balance had shifted. The ancient things were no longer supreme. Humanity had learned to resist. And in that resistance, in that refusal to fear, lay the hope of the future. Don't blink. Chapter 1. The Finger on the Birch. Don't blink, Thomas whispered, and his voice was wrong, cracked, broken, crawling up from somewhere deep in his chest where fear had been fermenting for days. For Christ's sake, Oscar, whatever you do, don't blink. If you blink, it moves. The bottle of rye whiskey trembled in Thomas's grip, pressed against his nose like a mask, like an oxygen line keeping him tethered to the living world. The cheap liquor sloshed against the glass, and Oscar could smell it from 3 feet away, not the comforting amber of bar whiskey but something sharper, chemical, industrial. The smell of survival, not pleasure. But Oscar wasn't looking at Thomas. He was looking at the birch tree 20 feet ahead, its white bark peeling in strips like old paper, its trunk scarred with the initials of lovers who had carved their promises into the flesh of the living wood. The tree was wrong. Not dead, not diseased, but wrong in a way that made his skin prickle, his stomach clench, his rational mind. The mind that had mapped 3 metropolitan transit systems, that had designed infrastructure for 12 million people, that held a PhD from MIT, struggled to find purchase on what his eyes were showing him. There was something behind the birch tree. Not something, someone, something. Oscar could see it in his peripheral vision, a shape that shouldn't exist, a vertical slash of darkness that seemed to occupy the space between the tree and the air itself. It was tall, too tall, its proportions stretched like pulled taffy, its silhouette suggesting limbs that bent wrong, joints that angled in directions human anatomy didn't allow. And it was watching him. He could feel it. The weight of its attention pressed against his back like a physical force, like standing too close to a furnace. Thomas, Oscar said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will, what am I looking at? You're not looking at it, Thomas said, and his breath hitched, a wet sound like a sob. That's the point. You can't look at it. If you look at it directly, it moves. It goes somewhere else, behind something else, behind you. Oscar's rational mind, the part of him that had built his career, his reputation, his entire sense of self, screamed for an explanation. Optical illusion, pareidolia, a trick of the light filtering through the canopy, creating shadows that seemed to move. But another part of him, older and deeper, the part that remembered being prey, knew what he was seeing. It was behind the birch tree, but when he tried to focus on it to bring his central vision to bear, it was gone. Not moved, not vanished, simply no longer there. And in the corner of his eye, in the peripheral vision he wasn't supposed to trust, he could see it now behind the oak tree to his left. It was behind the pine, Thomas sobbed. I saw it, I swear I saw it, and then I blinked and it was behind the birch, and then I blinked again. His voice broke into pieces. It's behind you now, Oscar. It's been behind you since we left camp, since yesterday, since you arrived. Oscar didn't turn around. He knew what he would see. Nothing. Empty forest. Shadows. The suggestion of movement that vanished when you tried to track it. The thing Thomas had called it the Hidebehind, a word that tasted like old folklore and children's nightmares, existed only in the gaps, the blind spots, the spaces where human vision failed. He understood now, in his gut if not in his mind. The Hidebehind didn't move through space. It moved through attention. It occupied the negative space of perception, the natural blind spot created by the optic nerve, the temporary darkness behind every blink, the peripheral void where the brain filled in what it expected to see rather than what was actually there. "The whiskey," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Keep it close. The smell. It hates the smell. It's the only thing that keeps them back." Oscar reached into his jacket pocket and felt the weight of his flask, the one Hendricks had forced on him that morning, the one he'd filled with moonshine from the camp still. He hadn't understood then. He thought it was superstition, rustic folklore, the quaint traditions of men who spent too much time in the wilderness. Now, with the weight of something's attention pressing against his spine, he understood. The flask was a weapon, not against bears, not against wolves, but against something that had learned to hunt in the architecture of human perception. "We need to run," Oscar said. "We need to get back to the road." "We can't," Thomas said. "Don't you understand? It's hurting us. It's been hurting us since camp. Every time we try to go back, it appears behind us, cuts us off, forces us deeper. It's not hunting, Oscar, it's playing." The distinction landed like a stone in Oscar's chest. A hunter killed for food, a player killed for sport, and the thing behind the birch tree, behind the oak tree, behind the space just over his left shoulder, was clearly playing. He could smell it now, cutting through the whiskey and the pine and the cold. A sweet, rotten odor like meat left in a warm room, like fruit on the edge of fermentation, like something that had been dead for days but refused to stop moving. The smell of the hollow, Thomas had called it. The smell of where they took you. "Thomas," Oscar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "On 3 we move. 1. "Thomas is already gone," said a voice from behind the birch tree, and it was Thomas's voice, every nuance perfect, every inflection exact, but layered with something else underneath, something hollow, empty, wearing human speech like a mask. "Thomas has been gone since yesterday. Thomas is in the hollow now. Thomas is being prepared. You should join him, Oscar. It's peaceful there, it's quiet." Oscar spun, his rational mind shattering against the impossibility, and saw only empty forest, only snow, only the birch tree standing straight and white and innocent. When he turned back to Thomas, the logger was gone. The bottle of rye lay on the frozen ground, the cap off, the contents pooling in a dark stain that steamed in the cold air. The whiskey smell was overwhelming, sharp enough to cut through the sweet rot that had filled Oscar's nostrils. And somewhere in the darkness between the trees, Oscar heard a sound. Not footsteps, not breathing. Something wet and sliding, like heavy silk being dragged over pine needles, like flesh moving over flesh, retreating toward the deep woods. He ran. 3 days earlier, Oscar Vane had believed that the world was a rational place. He arrived at the Northwoods logging camp in a rental truck, his equipment packed in hard cases, his satellite phone charged, his attitude set to the familiar mode of professional superiority. He was a surveyor, an urban planner, a man of maps and measurements and data. He had designed transit systems for 3 major cities, optimized land use for millions of people, solved problems that others considered impossible. He did not believe in monsters. The camp was smaller than he expected, a cluster of temporary buildings on a cleared hillside, an equipment yard filled with machines that looked like mechanical insects, a single access road that wound through 10 miles of dense forest to reach the nearest highway. 12 men lived here during the logging season, rotating out every 2 weeks for supplies and rest. They would be his subjects, his guides, his obstacles to the efficient completion of his work. Hendricks met him at the equipment yard. The foreman was a mountain in human form, a barrel-chested man with a beard that reached his chest and hands like battered leather gloves. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he looked Oscar up and down with eyes that had spent 40 years reading forest conditions, gauging wind, predicting weather from the color of the sky. "You the surveyor?" Hendricks asked. "Dr. Oscar Vane, Urban Planning and Land Use Optimization, MIT. I assume you've been briefed on my requirements. Hendrick's expression didn't change. You'll have an assistant, Thomas, knows these woods better than anyone. I don't need an assistant, I work alone. You work with Thomas, Hendrick said, and there was weight in his voice. Not authority exactly, but the gravity of experience, the confidence of a man who had survived things that couldn't be explained. Or you don't work at all. Company policy. Oscar almost refused. He almost turned around, got back in his truck, and drove back to Minneapolis to file a complaint with Arbor Consolidated's management. But the fee was substantial, the project was important, and the recession had made consulting work harder to come by. He swallowed his pride. Fine, where do I find him? But first, Hendricks reached into his jacket and produced a flask, a battered metal container that looked like it had been carried for decades. You need to fill this. I don't drink on the job. You don't drink this, Hendricks said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You carry it. You keep it on you at all times. You never let it get empty. You walk with your back to someone else, never alone. You sleep with it under your pillow. And if you see something in your peripheral vision, something that shouldn't be there, you open it and let the smell out. Oscar almost laughed, almost. But Hendrick's eyes were too serious, too haunted, his voice too steady. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't hazing. This was survival. Local superstitions, Oscar said carefully. I've read about the Hidebehind legends. They're common in logging communities. A convenient explanation for unexplained accidents, bear attacks, disappearances. I'm not interested in folklore, Mr. Hendricks. I'm here to do a job. Hendricks held his gaze for a long moment, then extended the flask. Take it, or leave. Oscar took it. It was heavier than he expected, filled with liquid that sloshed against the metal. He tucked it into his jacket pocket, feeling foolish and annoyed and strangely exposed. Welcome to the Northwoods, Hendricks said, and there was no welcome in his voice at all. Thomas was waiting in the mess hall, a lean man in his 30s with skin like tanned leather and eyes that never settled on any one thing for long. He was sitting with 3 other men, playing cards with a deck that looked like it had survived a war. They looked up when Oscar entered, their expressions ranging from hostility to resignation to something that looked almost like pity. The professor, one of them said, a burly man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. Come to teach us how to chop trees. I'm a surveyor, Oscar said, keeping his voice neutral. Not a logger. I have no interest in your profession. I simply need to collect data. Data, the man repeated, sneering. That's what we're worth to you, data points. That's Miller, Thomas said, standing up, gathering his cards with casual efficiency. Ignore him. He's bitter because the company won't let him work the North Ridge. I'm Thomas. I'll be your guide. They shook hands. Thomas's palm was calloused, his grip firm, his presence radiating a competence that no credential could match. This was a man comfortable in his element, at home in a world that Oscar didn't understand. I need to start immediately, Oscar said. GPS calibration, LADAR testing. How soon can we begin? Tomorrow morning, Thomas said. Tonight you meet the crew, and he glanced at Oscar's pocket. You fill that flask. Hendricks mentioned something about walking in groups. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. The short version, there's a still in the supply shed. We make it ourselves. Too strong to drink would blind you, but it's necessary for the perimeter. The perimeter, Oscar repeated. Against what exactly? Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You wouldn't believe me, you'll see. Or rather, you won't. That's the point. That night Oscar lay in his assigned bunk, a narrow cot in a prefabricated cabin shared with 3 other men, listening to the forest. The North Woods were different from any environment he had experienced. In the city, even at night, there was always sound, traffic, voices, the hum of infrastructure. Here, the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional creak of branches, the distant call of an owl. But there was something else, a presence, a sense of vast patience, of something aware and watching from the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. He told himself it was imagination, the power of suggestion, the influence of Hendrik's strange warnings, but he found himself clutching the flask under his pillow, his fingers wrapped around the cool metal, seeking comfort in its weight. The moonshine smelled like industrial solvent mixed with rotting fruit. Oscar had filled it at the still, watching the clear liquid drip from copper coils, filling his container with a substance that was technically alcohol but had nothing in common with whiskey or vodka. This was survival gear, a weapon, a barrier against something that couldn't be fought with muscle or reason. He didn't understand why, not yet. Morning came with the gray light of a northern dawn, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised snow. Oscar rose early, dressed in layers of technical fabric, and found Thomas waiting with 2 plates of eggs, bacon, and coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. "We start with the South Ridge," Thomas said. "Easiest terrain, get your bearings." "I don't need easy. I need comprehensive. Every square meter of the purchased land must be documented." "Every square meter," Thomas repeated, and there was something in his voice that Oscar couldn't interpret. "Sure, we'll get there." They set out after breakfast. Oscar carried his GPS unit and tripod. Thomas carried a pack with water, emergency supplies, and 2 flasks, one in his pocket, one clipped to his belt, ready to replace the first when it ran low. "2?" Oscar asked. "Because one might not be enough," Thomas said. "Because the thing that lives here, the thing we keep out with the alcohol, it learns, it adapts. If it knows you only have one, it'll wait until you're empty. Then it comes." "This thing," Oscar said, "you never name it." Thomas walked in silence for a moment, his boots crunching on frozen ground. "We call it the Hidebehind. Old name. Older than the logging camps, older than the settlers, maybe older than the forests. It's not a bear, not a wolf, not anything in the field guides." "Then what is it?" "It's what lives in the blind spot," Thomas said. "What you can't see unless you're not looking at it. What follows you when you walk alone, stands behind you when you're by yourself, occupies the space your eyes can't quite reach." Oscar wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as superstitious nonsense, but Thomas' voice was too steady, his fear too genuine. And there was something else. Oscar's peripheral vision was playing tricks. Every time he turned his head, he caught glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows that vanished when he tried to focus on them. "Your brain fills in your blind spots," Thomas continued. "The optic nerve creates a gap and your mind covers it with what it expects to see. The Hidebehind lives in that gap. It moves when you blink. It moves when you turn your head. It moves through the cracks in your attention. And it's fast, Oscar, not fast like a deer, fast like thought, like perception itself." "Impossible," Oscar said. "Nothing moves faster than the eye can track." "Nothing natural," Thomas agreed. "But the Hidebehind isn't natural, not the way we understand it. It's older than these woods, older than the glaciers. It's been here since the world was young and dark, and it learned to use our own senses against us." They reached the first survey point, a clearing on the South Ridge with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Oscar set up his equipment, calibrating the GPS, beginning the methodical process he had performed 1,000 times. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something standing just behind him, just out of sight. "You feel it," Thomas said. "I feel like I'm being observed, something behind me." "There is," Thomas said. "But as long as you don't turn around, as long as you keep your back to me or to a tree, it can't get close enough to touch. The alcohol helps, the smell confuses it, but the real defense is never being alone, never creating a blind spot it can occupy." Oscar worked for 3 hours, taking readings, recording data, trying to focus on the rational, the measurable. But the feeling grew stronger with every minute until he could barely concentrate. Finally, he packed up and suggested they return to camp. Thomas agreed readily, perhaps too readily, and they set off along the trail. They walked side by side, shoulders almost touching. Thomas kept his flask in his hand now, cap unscrewed, the sharp smell cutting through the cold air. "It's close," Thomas whispered. "I can feel it." "I don't see anything," Oscar said, though his heart raced. "You won't, not until it's too late. Just keep walking, don't look back." Thomas stopped abruptly, his hand shooting out to grab Oscar's arm, fingers digging in with painful intensity. Oscar followed his gaze and saw it. A birch tree by the trail, its white bark gleaming, its trunk leaning at a slight angle toward the path. "It wasn't leaning this morning," Thomas said, voice barely audible. "It was straight. I remember it was straight." Oscar looked at the tree. The trunk was bent, pressed inward as if something heavy leaned against it from behind. But there was nothing there, only more trees, only shadows, only empty forest. "Trees lean," Oscar said. "Wind, snow load, root damage." "Not this tree," Thomas said. "Not this fast. Look." He pointed at the base, where snow was disturbed, compressed, marked with patterns that might have been footprints or might have been something else entirely. Something was here, something heavy, something tall. Oscar bent to examine the marks. The snow showed 2 narrow depressions, spaced about 18 inches apart, elongated and strange. But when he looked closer, the pattern seemed to shift, to become less clear, as if the thing that made them was still somehow present, distorting his perception. "We need to go," Thomas said, pulling him upright. "Now." They walked faster now, Thomas slightly ahead, Oscar's hand on his shoulder, maintaining physical contact, ensuring neither was ever truly alone. The sense of pursuit grew stronger until Oscar could hear his heartbeat in his ears, feel his breath coming in ragged gasps despite the cold. Behind them something followed. Not running, not rushing, but moving with terrible patience, occupying spaces they had just vacated, filling blind spots they created with every step. They reached camp in late afternoon. Hendricks met them at the equipment yard, his expression grim. "You felt it," he said. "We felt something," Oscar admitted. "A presence being watched." "It's getting bolder," Thomas said, voice shaking. "It touched the birch, left marks. It's not hiding as much." Hendricks nodded slowly. "Days are getting shorter. Dark is getting longer. It always gets worse in winter." "What is it?" Oscar demanded. "What are you all so afraid of? An animal, a person, hallucination? I refuse to believe." "Miller's gone," Hendricks said, interrupting. "Went out this morning to check the North Ridge. Didn't come back for lunch. We found his flask by the creek, empty." The silence that followed was deeper than the silence of the forest. "I told him not to go alone," Thomas whispered. "You told him," Hendricks agreed. "But Miller never listened. Thought he was smarter than the woods, smarter than the old warnings." Oscar thought of the man who had sneered at him in the mess hall. Miller was dead now, or worse, and Oscar felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief, the survivor's calculus. "We need to search for him," Oscar said. "Call the authorities." "No authorities," Hendricks said. "Not out here, not for this. We search at first light in groups of 3 with full flasks, and if we find him," his jaw worked. "We don't bring him back. We mark the location and leave. That's the rule." "That's insane," Oscar said. "If he's injured." "He's not injured," Thomas said, voice hollow. "He's in the hollow. That's what the Hidebehind does. It takes you to the hollow. It prepares you there." "Prepares you for what?" But Thomas wouldn't answer, and Hendricks had already turned away, walking toward the mess hall with heavy steps. That night Oscar lay in his bunk, listening to the camp. The men were quieter than before, their movements careful, their hands checking flasks, refilling from the still. The atmosphere was that of a besieged fortress. He thought about the birch tree, the way it had leaned, the marks in the snow. He thought about Miller, alone on the north ridge with an empty flask. He thought about Thomas' words, "It moves when you blink." He lay awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the ceiling, hand wrapped around the flask. But in the morning, they found the claw marks. They were on the back of Oscar's tent, carved from the inside out, 5 parallel gouges in the heavy canvas that went all the way through. The tent had been locked, no entry point visible, but the marks were there, fresh, as if something had reached through the fabric from the space behind it. "It was here," Thomas said, face pale. "Last night in the camp." Oscar stared at the marks, his rational mind spinning. An animal, but no animal could carve through canvas with such precision from the inside out. A person, but there was no way in, no sign of entry. "Impossible," Oscar whispered. "Impossible," Thomas agreed. "But real. It's getting bolder, Oscar. It's coming into camp now." Hendricks called a meeting in the mess hall. The flask rule was reinforced. No one goes anywhere alone, not even to the latrine. No one lets their flask get below half full. No one turns their back on empty space. "We're pulling out," Hendricks announced. "Pack essential gear. We leave at noon. Trucks will meet us at the highway. We're done here until winter passes." The men nodded, relief visible. Only Oscar objected. "I haven't finished the survey. The company expects complete data." "The company can find another surveyor," Hendricks said. "You're lucky to be alive, Dr. Vane. Don't push it." But Oscar couldn't let it go. His professional pride, his need for completion, he had to understand what was happening. "Give me until noon," he said. "I need to collect my equipment." Hendricks looked at him, then nodded. 2 hours. Thomas goes with you. If you're not back, we leave without you." Oscar agreed, and they set out to retrieve his survey equipment. They walked in silence, flask rule observed, neither man more than an arm's length from the other. But as they walked, Oscar became aware of a change. The silence was deeper now, more absolute. The normal sounds of winter woods had vanished. Even the wind had died, leaving the air still and heavy. "Something's wrong," Thomas whispered. "It's close, closer than ever." They reached the first survey point and found the equipment undisturbed. At the 4th point, they found the trail. It was not a human trail. It was a drag mark, a path of disturbed snow and compressed vegetation leading from the survey point into deep woods, into thickets where trees grew too close for any human to pass. The mark was wide, fresh, the snow still falling back into depressions. "Miller," Thomas breathed. "This is how it takes them, drags them to the hollow." "We need to follow it," Oscar said, "if he's still alive." "He's not alive," Thomas said. "Not the way you mean, but we can find him, see what it does, maybe understand it." Oscar knew it was foolish, but the scientist in him was curious, and he couldn't abandon Miller to whatever waited in the hollow. They followed the trail. Chapter 2: The Hollow Trail. The trail led deeper than Oscar had ever been, beyond survey boundaries, into territory that was old and wild and untouched. The trees here were giants, their trunks wider than a man was tall, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy that blocked the sky. The snow was deeper, unmarked by human passage, and the silence was absolute. But it wasn't just silence. It was the silence of a space being occupied, the hush of something large and aware holding its breath. Oscar felt it in his spine, a pressure that made him want to turn around, to look behind him, to check the spaces his eyes couldn't see. "Don't," Thomas whispered, sensing his intention. "Whatever you do, don't turn around. Keep your eyes forward. Keep your hand on my shoulder." Oscar did as he was told, his palm resting on the rough fabric of Thomas's jacket, maintaining the physical contact that kept them from being alone. They walked in the formation the loggers used, slightly staggered, never directly behind each other, creating a configuration where no blind spot existed for more than a fraction of a second. But even with these precautions, Oscar could feel it. The Hidebehind was following them. He couldn't see it. He refused to turn his head, but he could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against his back. And there was something else, a distortion in the air around them, a warping of space that made objects seem to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. "It's hurting us," Thomas said, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow. "Can't you feel it? It's not just following, it's directing, pushing us towards something." Oscar tried to focus on his surroundings, to apply the rational observation techniques that had served him throughout his career. But the forest refused to cooperate. Trees seemed to move in his peripheral vision, their positions changing between glances. The path ahead appeared to shift, opening and closing like a mouth. The snow itself seemed to ripple, as if something heavy was sliding beneath its surface. "The peripheral glitch," Oscar said, remembering the term from his research. "That's what you call it." "The old loggers called it the spaces between," Thomas said. "The places your eyes can't quite reach. The Hidebehind lives there. It doesn't exist in the same way we do. It occupies the gaps in our perception." "That's impossible," Oscar said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Nothing can exist only in peripheral vision." "It doesn't exist only there," Thomas said. "It can be seen directly. But when you look at it, when you bring your full attention to bear, it moves. It jumps. Not through space, through the cracks in your perception. It goes from where you were looking to where you're not looking. From behind the tree you were watching to behind your own back." Oscar tried to visualize what Thomas was describing. A creature that moved not by traversing distance but by exploiting the mechanics of human sight. The blind spot in the human eye, where the optic nerve connected to the retina, creating a gap in vision that the brain filled in with expected information. The momentary darkness during a blink. The peripheral vision that detected motion but couldn't resolve detail. "It travels through attention," Oscar said slowly, working it out. "Through the act of observation itself. When you observe it directly, you create a pocket of unobserved space behind you. It moves into that pocket." "Yes," Thomas said, and there was relief in his voice. "You understand. That's why we walk in groups. That's why we never turn our backs. That's why the alcohol works. The smell creates a barrier, confuses it, makes the space around us unoccupiable." "But it's not perfect," Oscar said. "If it was perfect, Miller would still be here." "Nothing's perfect," Thomas agreed. "And it's learning, adapting, getting bolder." The trail ended at a limestone gorge, a narrow cleft where bedrock had cracked and shifted, creating a labyrinth of passages and chambers. The drag marks led into the largest opening, a cave mouth that breathed cold air and darkness. "The hollow," Thomas whispered. "This is where it takes them." Oscar peered into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through blackness to reveal walls of stone and ice, passages twisting and descending. The air smelled of rot and age and something else, something sweet and terrible that reminded Oscar of the alcohol in his flask but darker, more ancient. "We can't go in," Thomas said. "Not without more men, more flasks." "Then we mark the location and return," Oscar agreed. "Tell Hendricks, organize a proper search party." They turned to leave, and Oscar saw it. It was in his peripheral vision, a shape occupying the space behind a nearby oak tree. Tall, thin, impossibly dark. He didn't turn his head, didn't try to look directly at it, kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. But he could feel it watching him, could feel its hunger and patience. "Thomas," Oscar whispered, "don't turn around, but tell me, is there something behind that oak tree?" Thomas didn't answer. Oscar felt the shoulder under his hand stiffen, muscles tensing. "Thomas." "I see it," Thomas whispered back. "In the corner of my eye, it's not behind the tree, it's part of the tree. No, it's behind the tree. No, it's—" His voice broke. "I don't know what I'm seeing. I can't look at it. If I look, it'll move." "We walk," Oscar said, voice steadier than he felt. Slowly, don't turn. They walked. Each step was an eternity. The thing behind the oak tree followed them, moving from tree to tree, occupying blind spots with every forward motion. Oscar could feel it, sense it, almost smell it, that sweet, rotten scent growing stronger. Then Thomas stumbled. It was small, a root beneath the snow, a momentary loss of balance. But in that instant, Thomas turned instinctively, looking behind him. "It's," Thomas started to say. Then he was gone. Not pulled, not dragged, simply gone. One moment he was there, his shoulder under Oscar's hand, his breath visible in the cold. The next moment, empty space. Oscar stood frozen, hand extended, touching nothing. He turned slowly, terrified of what he would see, and found only empty forest, only snow, only silence. Thomas was gone. And somewhere in the distance, Oscar heard the sound of something being dragged through undergrowth, wet sliding over frozen ground, retreating toward the limestone gorge. Oscar ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't follow the rules. He simply ran, legs pumping, lungs burning. He ran until he reached camp, burst through the mess hall door, collapsed against a table. "Thomas," he gasped. "It's got Thomas, it took him, right in front of me." The men stared, faces pale, hands moving to flasks. Hendricks stepped forward, grim. "Where?" "The gorge, the limestone caves. It dragged him, I heard it." "The hollow," someone whispered. "It took him to the hollow." "We're leaving," Hendricks said. "Now pack what you can carry. We walk in groups, tight formation, flasks out. Anyone falls behind, we don't stop. Anyone looks back, we don't wait, we get to the highway." The men moved with desperation, gathering essentials, forming a tight knot. Oscar stood among them, shaking, his flask clutched in hand. They set out into the woods, 9 men walking shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall that left no space for the thing to occupy. Flasks were open, sharp alcohol smell cutting through cold air. But it followed them. Oscar could feel it, sense its presence in spaces between trees, in shadows behind boulders, in corners of vision he refused to acknowledge. It was hurting them, forcing them along a specific path. "It's not letting us go to the highway," a man said, voice shaking. "It's turning us, pushing us north." "Keep walking," Hendricks ordered. "Don't stop, don't look back." They walked for hours, the creature never attacking, never showing itself. But they all felt it, all sensed it, knew they were being driven like cattle toward a slaughterhouse. In late afternoon, they reached a clearing, and Oscar realized with horror where they were. It was the birch tree, the same one from yesterday, now surrounded by a circle of disturbed snow, a ring of compressed earth suggesting something had paced around it, waited, prepared. "The trap," Oscar whispered. "It's closing the trap." And then the storm hit. Not natural, the sky had been clear, but something that emerged from the forest itself. A sudden blast of wind and snow and darkness that separated the men, scattered them, broke their formation. Oscar felt hands grab him, felt himself pulled, felt the world spin. Then he was alone. He found himself on his knees in snow, flask gone, hands empty, surroundings transformed. The clearing was different now, the birch tree replaced by a grove of similar trees, all leaning, all surrounded by circles of disturbed snow. And in spaces between trees and shadows that moved when he blinked, Oscar could see them. The Hidebehinds, not one, dozens, a forest of them standing behind every tree, occupying every blind spot, filling the spaces human vision couldn't reach. "Thomas," Oscar called out. "Hendricks, anyone?" No answer, only wind, creaking branches, wet sliding. Oscar stood, legs shaking. He was alone, unarmed, surrounded by creatures that could move faster than thought, occupy spaces behind his own back. He was going to die here, or worse, be dragged to the hollow, prepared. Unless... He remembered the flask, how the smell kept them back. He'd lost his own, but Thomas had carried two. If he could find Thomas's body, find the flasks, he might have a chance. He walked through the grove, keeping eyes forward, refusing to look at shapes moving in peripheral vision. He found Thomas's pack first, discarded in snow, contents spilled. Then the boots, placed side by side as if Thomas had simply stepped out of them. Then he found Thomas, or what was left. The body, suspended between two birch trees, held by something like frozen sap or crystallized resin. Thomas's eyes were open, staring at nothing, mouth frozen in a rictus of horror. But that wasn't the worst part. Thomas had been hollowed. His chest was open, ribs spread like wings, and where organs should have been, heart, lungs, liver, intestines. There was only empty space, only crystallized resin, only terrible void. Oscar vomited, body reacting to the violation. When he wiped his mouth and looked again, he saw the flasks. One empty, discarded, the other half full, sealed. He grabbed it and ran. The Hidebehinds followed, their presence pressing against his back. But they didn't touch him. The alcohol smell, sharp, chemical, overwhelming, kept them at bay, creating a bubble of safety. Oscar ran until he reached the gorge, the limestone caves. He stopped, gasping. He couldn't go back, creatures were behind him, hurting him. He couldn't stay. The flask was half empty, and when it ran out, they would take him. He had only one option. He had to go into the hollow, find the source, the lair. Maybe there was another exit, maybe he could find something. He descended into darkness. The cave swallowed him, light bouncing off walls of stone and ice. Air grew warmer, smell stronger, sweet, rotten, marking presence. Then he found the gallery. It was a chamber large as a cathedral, ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were covered with them, the hollowed ones, the prepared, victims of the Hidebehinds. Dozens, hundreds, men and women from different eras, different clothing. Rangers and hikers and explorers going back decades, perhaps centuries. All hollowed, all suspended, all facing inward toward the center where something waited. Oscar didn't look at it. He knew that if he did, if he tried to see what occupied the center, he would be lost. He crept along the wall, light playing over hollowed victims. The Hidebehinds had been here for thousands of years. The chamber was a museum of predation spanning millennia. They weren't new, weren't mutations. They were ancient, patient, endlessly hungry. Oscar reached the far side and found a passage leading upward. He followed it, climbing, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him he heard sounds of pursuit, wet sliding, rasp of skin on stone. He burst out of the cave into twilight, sky bruised purple above trees. He was somewhere in the woods, somewhere north of camp, somewhere he didn't recognize. But he was alive and he had the flask. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsed against a tree, gasping. The flask was almost empty now, alcohol evaporating in cold air. Minutes, maybe less. He looked around. Forest was dark, moon rising through trees, casting long shadows that moved and shifted and hid things. Then he saw it. A light in the distance, the camp, the road, rescue. Oscar gathered his last strength and stumbled toward it. He reached the source and stopped, hope dying. It wasn't the camp. It was the truck, headlights blazing, engine running, doors open. And standing beside it, silhouetted against the light, was something tall and thin. "Oscar," it said, in a voice that was Thomas's voice and Hendrik's voice and the voices of all the hollowed ones. "We've been waiting for you." Oscar backed away, but he could feel them behind him now, the forest full of them, blind spots occupied, shadows alive. He was surrounded, trapped, herded to this final destination. "We need you, Oscar," the thing said. "Your knowledge, your maps, your understanding of how the world works. We need to know where to hunt, where the humans are clustered. You're going to help us, Oscar. You're going to be part of our expansion." "No," Oscar whispered. "Yes," the thing said, and it moved, faster than thought. But Oscar threw the flask, the last alcohol at the creature's head. It struck, shattered, released contents in a spray of chemical fire that made the thing shriek and recoil. Oscar ran past it, toward the truck, hand finding the door handle, body throwing itself into the driver's seat. He slammed the door, hit the lock. The thing was recovering, its form shifting, moving through the blind spot created by the door frame. Oscar could feel it, sense it, know it was right outside. He didn't look away. He kept eyes fixed on rearview mirror, watching in reflection, knowing it couldn't occupy space being observed. He started the engine, floored the accelerator. The truck surged forward, crashing through undergrowth. Oscar held the wheel, eyes flicking between road and mirror, watching shapes that followed, kept pace. He drove for miles, forest giving way to clearings, to fields, to the highway. He saw other cars, other people, civilization. He didn't stop. He drove until he reached Minneapolis, until he reached the airport, until he was on a plane. And as the plane rose, Oscar looked out at the forest below, endless green hiding ancient horrors. He thought of Thomas, hollowed in the cave. He thought of the others, lost. He thought of the Hidebehinds, waiting for the next chance to expand. He knew, with certainty settling like ice, that he hadn't escaped, only postponed. He closed his eyes, exhausted. But in the darkness he could still see them, the tall, thin shapes, the shadows that moved when he blinked. And when he opened his eyes for just a moment, he thought he saw something behind the seat in front of him. Something tall, something thin, something waiting. He didn't blink, he refused to blink. But eventually, everyone has to blink. Chapter 3: The Breaking Point. The truck died 3 miles from the highway. Oscar had been driving blindly, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, waiting for the moment when his pursuers would catch up. The fuel gauge had been dropping steadily, but he hadn't noticed, too focused on the shapes that flickered at the edges of his headlights, the shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Now the engine coughed, sputtered, and went silent. The truck coasted to a stop on the shoulder of a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years, surrounded by forest that pressed against both sides like a mouth closing. Oscar sat in the silence, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The normal sounds, crickets, owls, the whisper of wind, had been replaced by a hush that felt deliberate, orchestrated, the silence of something holding its breath. He checked the rearview mirror, empty darkness, nothing visible. But he could feel them, the Hidebehinds. They were in the woods on both sides of the road, occupying the blind spots created by the angle of the mirrors, the frame of the windshield, the A-pillars that supported the roof. He could feel their attention pressing against him like a physical weight, the collective hunger of creatures that had been hunting him for hours. And he had no alcohol. The flask was gone, shattered against the creature's head back at the clearing. He was defenseless. Oscar grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment, heavy metal, the only weapon he had left, and opened the door. The night air was cold, sharp, smelling of pine and decay and something else, something sweet and rotten that made his stomach clench. He had to run. The highway was 3 miles ahead, 3 miles of dark road surrounded by forest that hid things that shouldn't exist, 3 miles of running while carrying his own blind spots, his own peripheral vision, his own vulnerable back. He started jogging, keeping to the center of the road, maximizing his field of vision. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing gravel and potholes and the occasional fallen branch. Behind him, the truck sat abandoned, its shape slowly swallowed by shadow. He ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exertion. The road stretched ahead, straight and narrow, flanked by trees that seemed to lean toward him, their branches reaching. And then he heard it. The rasping sound, the one Thomas had described, Not a scream, not a growl, but a rhythmic noise like two knives being sharpened against each other, like bone scraping bone, like something being flensed. It came from behind him, from the trees to his left, from the trees to his right, everywhere and nowhere, filling the night. Oscar ran faster, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The sound followed, keeping pace, never quite catching up, never quite falling behind. It was playing with him, hurting him. He realized with horror that he was being funneled. The road ahead was changing, subtle shifts in direction that he hadn't noticed, curves that bent toward a specific destination. The creatures, plural, there were so many now, were directing him, using the road itself as a chute toward whatever waited ahead. The sound changed. The rasping became a clicking, rhythmic and precise, like claws on stone, like counting, like anticipating. Oscar crested a rise and saw it. The road ended, not in a barrier or a washout, but in a dense thicket of birch trees that had grown across the path, their white trunks creating a wall of vertical lines, their branches interlocking to form an impenetrable barrier. The trees were wrong, too close together, too uniform, too perfectly positioned. They had been planted or grown or manifested here for a purpose. It was the trap, the final enclosure. Oscar stopped, gasping, spinning in a circle. Behind him, the road stretched back toward the truck, but the darkness was absolute and he could feel them filling it, occupying every blind spot, every shadow, every space his light didn't reach. To his left and right, the forest pressed close, the trees too dense to penetrate. He was surrounded. "You understand now," said a voice from the darkness, and it was Thomas's voice, perfectly mimicked, every nuance exact. "You understand how we hunt, not with claws and teeth, though we have those, not with speed, though we are fast. We hunt with space, with the gaps in your perception, with the spaces you cannot see." Oscar swept his flashlight across the birch thicket, trying to find the speaker. But the light revealed only trees, only shadows, only the empty spaces between. "You are an interesting one," the voice continued, moving from left to right, behind him to his right, always occupying the space he wasn't looking. "The others, the loggers, they understood fear immediately. They knew what we were. But you needed to understand. You needed logic, explanation, reason. That is rare. That is valuable." "What do you want?" Oscar shouted, his voice cracking. "What we have always wanted," the voice said, now coming from directly behind him, so close he could feel the breath of it, cold and smelling of the hollow. "To hunt, to feed, to expand. And you are going to help us, Oscar Vane. You are going to show us where the cities are, where the humans cluster in their millions. You are going to be our guide to the world beyond these woods." "No," Oscar said. "Yes," the voice whispered, and something touched his shoulder. Oscar spun, flashlight raised like a club, but there was nothing there. Only empty road, only darkness. "We have been here since your kind first walked these forests," the voice said, moving to his left behind the nearest birch tree. "We have always been here. We will always be here. The only question is whether you join us willingly, as a guide, as a voice, or as one of the prepared." Oscar backed toward the thicket, his shoulder blades pressing against the white bark of the closest birch. The trees were cold, impossibly cold, as if they weren't wood at all but something else, something that grew in the hollow and had learned to mimic the form of trees. "The prepared," Oscar repeated, his mind racing. "The hollowed ones, what does that mean? Why do you hollow them?" "We don't eat flesh," the voice said, and now there were multiple voices, a chorus of whispers coming from every direction, from every blind spot, from every tree. "Flesh rots, flesh fails. We eat something more enduring. We eat the space where the person was. We eat their absence. We preserve the shell, the memory of them, and we feast on the void." Oscar understood now, in a way he wished he didn't. The Hidebehinds were creatures of negative space, of absence, of the gaps between things. They didn't consume matter. They consumed the space matter occupied. The hollowed victims weren't eaten in the traditional sense. They were unmade, emptied, turned into vessels that contained nothing but the memory of what they had been. "Thomas," Oscar said, Is he still aware, in the hollow?" "Thomas is here," the voices said, and suddenly the rasping sound was back, but now it was rhythmic, patterned, almost like speech. "Thomas is speaking to you now, Oscar, through us. Thomas wants you to join him. Thomas says it's peaceful in the hollow, quiet, empty." "Thomas says you're lying," Oscar whispered. The voices laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves, like water over stone. "Thomas can't say anything. Thomas has no mouth, no lungs, no voice. Thomas is a shell, a memory, a space where a person used to be, but we can wear him. We can wear any of them. We can be Thomas when we need to be. We can be anyone." Oscar slumped against the tree, his strength failing. The flashlight was heavy in his hand, the batteries dimming, the beam weakening. He was going to die here, or worse. He was going to be hollowed, emptied, turned into a vessel for these things to wear. Unless... He remembered something Thomas had said back at the beginning before everything went wrong. The alcohol works, the smell confuses it, interferes with its hunting. But he had no alcohol, the flask was gone. Wait. He remembered the truck, the glove compartment, the emergency kit that every company vehicle carried, standard safety equipment mandated by corporate policy. Hand sanitizer, alcohol-based hand sanitizer. It wasn't much. It wasn't the high-proof moonshine that the loggers brewed, but it was alcohol, and it was all he had. "You're thinking," the voices said, amusement in their tone. "You're planning, that's good. We like the ones who fight. They taste better. The struggle adds flavor." "I'm not going to fight," Oscar said, and he dropped the flashlight, raised his hands in surrender. "I'm going to cooperate. I'm going to show you the cities. I'll be your guide." The voices went silent. The rasping stopped. The night held its breath. "Truly," the voice said, and it was Thomas's voice again, but layered with suspicion. "You surrender." "I surrender," Oscar said. "I can't fight you. I can't run from you. You're too old, too patient, too perfect at what you do, so I'll join you. But first," he reached into his pocket slowly, carefully, making sure they could see his hands. "First, I need something from my truck, a map. The maps I made of the forests. The ones that show the trails, the clearings, the best places to hunt." He could feel them considering, calculating. They were intelligent. He knew that now, intelligent in a way that was alien and terrible. They could understand deals, bargains, negotiations. But they were also predators, and predators didn't trust prey. "We will go together," the voice said. "You will walk. We will walk beside you, in your blind spots, in your peripheral vision. Always close enough to touch. Always ready to take you if you lie." "I understand," Oscar said. He started walking back toward the truck, his flashlight retrieved but kept at his side, the beam pointed down. He could feel them with him, their presence pressing against his left side, his right side, his back. They were walking in formation, surrounding him, occupying every space he couldn't see. He reached the truck and opened the driver's side door. The interior light came on, dim and yellow, illuminating the cab. Oscar reached into the glove compartment, rummaging, keeping his body turned so they couldn't see what he was doing. There, the hand sanitizer. A large bottle, corporate branded 80% alcohol. And beside it, the road flare, emergency signaling device. Bright red, meant to be lit and used to signal for help. Oscar's heart hammered. The flare. Light. Bright, intense, undeniable light. If Thomas was right about the alcohol confusing them, and if Oscar's theory about light was correct, that they existed in shadow in the gaps, then the flare might do more than confuse them. It might hurt them. "What are you doing?" the voice asked, suddenly sharp, suspicious. "Getting the map," Oscar said, his hand closing around the flare. "And something else. Something that will help you understand where to hunt." He turned slowly, keeping the flare hidden behind his back. He could feel them now all around him, their attention focused on his hands, his face, the spaces he occupied. They were curious, predators enjoying the moment before the kill. "Show us," the voice commanded. "I will," Oscar said, "but first look at this." He struck the flare. The ignition was violent, a burst of crimson light that turned night into day, that banished every shadow within 50 feet, that revealed everything the darkness had been hiding. And Oscar saw them. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, hundreds, tall, thin, impossibly elongated figures standing in the spaces between trees, behind the truck and the angles of the road. Their bodies were wrong, jointed backward, limbs too long, skin that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And their faces, if they were faces, were nothing but smooth, featureless planes that somehow conveyed hunger without having any features at all. The light hit them and they screamed. Not a sound of pain exactly, but of violation, of exposure, of being forced into a state they weren't meant to occupy. They reeled back, their forms blurring, trying to find shadows that no longer existed, trying to occupy blind spots that the flare had illuminated. Oscar ran. He ran through the space the creatures had vacated, the flare held high above his head, a torch of crimson light that kept them at bay. They hissed and shrieked and reached for him with hands that had too many joints, but the light pushed them back, forced them into retreat. He ran for the highway, for civilization, for the world of light and people and safety. The flare burned in his hand, hot and bright, the heat searing his palm, but he didn't care. He ran, and the creatures followed, but they couldn't get close enough to touch, couldn't occupy the spaces he ran through. He saw the highway ahead, the headlights of a passing truck, the yellow line painted down the center of the asphalt. He was almost there, almost safe. The flare died. It went out suddenly, the chemical reaction exhausted, leaving him in darkness. He dropped the spent tube and ran harder, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. Behind him he could hear them recovering, their rasping sounds returning, their forms filling the shadows that reasserted themselves. He burst onto the highway, his feet finding asphalt, his eyes finding the headlights of a semi-truck barreling toward him. The driver slammed on the brakes, the horn blaring, the truck skidding to a stop 10 feet away. Oscar scrambled around the front to the driver's side, pounding on the door. "Help, please, get me out of here." The window rolled down, revealing a face, middle-aged, bearded, confused but kind. "What the hell, buddy? You trying to get yourself killed?" "Please," Oscar gasped. "Please, I need to get away from here. Away from the woods, please." The driver looked at him, at his disheveled appearance, his wild eyes, his trembling hands, and his expression softened. "Okay, buddy, okay. Get in, passenger side. We'll get you to the next town." Oscar stumbled around the truck, his hand finding the passenger door handle, pulling it open. The interior light came on, warm and yellow and safe. He climbed in, collapsed into the seat, pulled the door shut. "You okay?" the driver asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Oscar whispered. "Something worse." The driver put the truck in gear, checked his mirrors, and froze. "What?" he started. Oscar followed his gaze to the side mirror and saw it. The mirror showed the highway behind them, empty and dark. But in the gap between what the mirror showed and what Oscar could see directly, in the blind spot created by the angle of the glass, something was standing. Tall, thin, watching. "Don't look at it," Oscar said quickly. Don't turn around, just drive, please, just drive." The driver hesitated, then stomped on the accelerator. The truck roared forward, tires squealing, leaving rubber on the asphalt. Oscar didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward, watching the road ahead, the white lines disappearing under the wheels, the darkness receding behind them. They drove for miles, the driver asking questions that Oscar didn't answer, the silence filled only by the rumble of the engine and the hiss of tires on pavement. Oscar kept his eyes fixed on the road, refusing to check the mirrors, refusing to look at the spaces behind him. He was safe, he was moving, he was away from the woods. The driver pulled into an all-night diner 40 miles from the forest, the neon sign buzzing and flickering. "I'm stopping here," he said. "Getting coffee. You should too. You look like you need it." Oscar nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He climbed out of the truck, his legs unsteady, his body exhausted. The parking lot was bright, illuminated by floodlights that banished every shadow, that left no space for the things to hide. He was safe. He walked toward the diner, the driver beside him, the door in front of them. He reached for the handle, pulled it open, the bell above it chiming. And as he stepped inside, as the warm air of the restaurant enveloped him, he felt it. A touch, cold and dry and deliberate. On the nape of his neck. Not his imagination, not a phantom sensation. A real touch, the pressure of a finger, long, thin, impossibly long, curling around his skin. Oscar froze, his hand still on the door, his body unable to move. The driver was already inside, walking toward the counter unaware. The diner was full of people, truckers, waitresses, travelers, all of them eating, talking, living, unaware of what had just walked in among them. The finger pressed harder, not hurting, just present. A reminder, a promise. Oscar realized, with horror that turned his blood to ice, that the creature hadn't been trying to kill him in the woods. It hadn't been playing with him, hadn't been herding him toward the highway by accident. It had been escorting him. It wanted him to escape, wanted him to reach civilization, to find safety, to let his guard down, because Oscar was useful, because Oscar knew things, about cities, about infrastructure, about where humans clustered in their millions. And because the Hidebehinds were expanding. They weren't just forest creatures anymore. They were following the roads, following the power lines, following the paths that humans had carved through the wilderness. And they needed guides, scouts, people who could show them where to hunt. The finger withdrew, the touch vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. But Oscar knew with a certainty that settled in his bones like frost, that it was still there, still behind him, still occupying the space he couldn't see. Not in the forest anymore. In the diner. He turned slowly, his heart hammering, and looked at the mirrors behind the counter, the reflective surfaces that showed the room behind him. The mirrors were empty. But in the gap between what the mirrors showed and what he could see directly, in the blind spot created by the angle of his vision, something was standing. Something tall. Something thin. Something waiting. Oscar stood in the doorway of the diner, surrounded by light and people and the sounds of civilization, and he understood at last that there was no escape. The Hidebehinds weren't just in the woods. They were everywhere. They were behind him now, in the space between his shoulder blades, in the gap his eyes could never quite reach. They were in the blind spots of the other diners, standing behind the waitress, behind the cook, behind the truck driver who had saved his life. And they were patient. They had waited 10,000 years. They could wait a little longer. Oscar walked to the counter and sat down, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on the mirror in front of him. In the reflection, he could see the room behind him, the tables, the people, the empty spaces between. But he knew what occupied those spaces. He knew what stood in the gaps. He ordered coffee. The waitress brought it, smiling, oblivious. Oscar took a sip. It was bitter. It was hot. It was real. But he couldn't taste it. All he could taste was the memory of the forest, the smell of the hollow, the sweet rot of the things that had followed him out of the woods. He looked in the mirror again, and for just a moment he thought he saw it. Not directly, never directly. But in the corner of his eye, in the peripheral vision he was learning not to trust, he saw a shape. Tall, thin. Standing behind him. He didn't turn around, he didn't blink. But eventually, everyone has to blink. Outside, the night was deep and dark and full of spaces where things could hide. The highway stretched into the distance, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness, connecting city to city, town to town, creating corridors of shadow that the creatures could follow. And somewhere in the darkness, a sound began. The rasping, the clicking, the sound of knives being sharpened against each other, of bone against bone, of something being prepared. It was the sound of the hunt. And it was getting closer. Chapter 4: The Physics of Absence. 3 days after his escape from the diner, Oscar found himself in a hotel room in Minneapolis, surrounded by newspaper clippings and handwritten notes, trying to understand what had happened to him. The authorities had found the logging camp abandoned. 11 men missing, presumed dead. The official report cited severe weather event and possible bear attack as explanations, but the bodies were never recovered. The company, Arbor Consolidated, had settled with the families quietly, offering generous compensation in exchange for silence. Oscar had been questioned for 6 hours by federal agents who seemed more interested in his mental state than in his testimony. They had shown him photographs of the camp, the equipment, the claw marks on tents. They had asked him repeatedly about wildlife encounters and possible hallucinations. He hadn't told them the truth. He knew what would happen if he did. Psychiatric evaluation, loss of professional standing, the destruction of everything he had built. But he couldn't forget. The memory of the Hidebehinds was burned into his mind, a constant presence at the edge of his consciousness. He saw them in every shadow, felt them in every blind spot, heard their rasping in the silence of his hotel room. And he was researching. The internet was full of stories, folklore, cryptozoology, unexplained disappearances. The Hidebehind was known by many names across many cultures. The Fachin in Ireland, the Lurker in the English moors, the Behind You in Appalachian hollows. Every forest, every wilderness, every place where humans walked and darkness waited had its version of the same creature. But the stories were incomplete. They described the hunting behavior, the disappearances, the peripheral nature of the creatures, but they didn't explain the physics. They didn't explain how something could exist only in the gaps of human perception. Oscar had a theory. He sketched it on hotel notepads, working through the mathematics of attention, the geometry of vision. The human eye had a blind spot, a region where the optic nerve connected to the retina, creating a gap in visual processing that the brain filled with expected information. But it wasn't just one spot. It was thousands of tiny gaps, micro moments of unobserved space that the brain papered over with prediction. And time. The moment of a blink lasted 300 milliseconds. During that brief darkness, the world continued, but the observer was blind. The brain filled in what happened, creating a seamless narrative of continuous perception. What if, Oscar theorized, the Hidebehinds occupied those gaps? What if they existed in the spaces between observations, the cracks in continuous perception? They weren't invisible, they were unobservable. They existed in the temporal and spatial blind spots that every human carried with them. And they moved through them, not by traversing physical distance, but by shifting from one gap to another. From the blind spot behind your head to the blind spot created by a tree trunk. From the darkness of a blink to the peripheral void beyond your focused attention. It explained everything: the impossibly fast movement, the inability to see them directly, the way they seemed to teleport from place to place. But it also meant they weren't supernatural. They were natural, in their way, creatures that had evolved to exploit the limitations of human perception. And if they were natural, they had weaknesses. Light eliminated blind spots. High-intensity illumination flooded the shadows, making the invisible visible. The alcohol, the high-proof moonshine the loggers brewed, confused them somehow. The chemical vapor interfered with their ability to track the gaps, to navigate the spaces between. Oscar wrote it all down, filling notebook after notebook with his theories, his observations, his desperate attempt to make sense of the impossible. And then he found the pattern. It was in the historical records, the folklore, the modern disappearances. The Hidebehinds weren't just hunting randomly. They were expanding, following the roads, the power lines, the paths humans carved through the wilderness. They were colonizing new territories, establishing new hunting grounds. And they were learning, adapting, getting bolder. The creatures in the old stories were cautious, careful, rarely venturing close to human settlements. But the recent reports, the disappearances in national parks, the unexplained deaths in remote communities, suggested a change. The Hidebehinds were hunting closer to civilization. They were taking more risks. Because the forests were shrinking. Climate change, logging, development. The wild places were disappearing, and the creatures that lived there were being forced to adapt or die. They were adapting. And Oscar had shown them the way. He thought back to his escape, to the moment the creature had touched his neck in the diner. It hadn't been threatening him. It had been marking him, identifying him as a scout, a guide, someone who knew where the humans clustered. He had led them out of the woods, not intentionally but effectively. By escaping, by reaching civilization, he had shown them the path, the roads, the corridors of shadow that connected wilderness to city. And now they were following. Oscar stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the Minneapolis skyline. The city was bright, illuminated, full of people, safe. But the streets between the buildings were dark. The alleys were shadows. The spaces behind billboards and bus stops and parked cars were gaps in the urban fabric, waiting to be occupied. He saw a movement in the reflection of the window, a shape in the glass that didn't match the room behind him. He spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Just his notes, his bed, the flickering light of the television he had left on for company. He turned back to the window. The shape was gone, but he knew with the certainty of trauma that he was being watched. They had followed him, from the north woods through the highways to this hotel, this room, this moment. And they were waiting. Oscar grabbed his jacket, his notebooks, his remaining belongings. He needed to leave. Now, before they got bold enough to take him, before they decided he was more useful as a vessel than as a guide. He pulled open the door and stepped into the hallway. The lights flickered. It was a small thing, a momentary dimming of the fluorescent tubes, but Oscar felt it in his spine. The hallway stretched before him, doors on either side, emergency exit sign glowing green at the far end. And in the gaps between the doors, in the shadows cast by the flickering lights, he saw them. Not directly, never directly. But in his peripheral vision, in the corners of his eyes, he saw shapes, tall, thin, occupying the spaces he wasn't looking at. He ran. Down the hallway, past the elevator, through the emergency exit door. The stairs were concrete and harshly lit, no shadows, no gaps. He descended 3 flights, boots pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. The lobby was bright, full of people checking in, checking out, living normal lives. Oscar walked through them, trying to look normal, trying not to panic. But he could feel them, in the space behind the potted plants, behind the reception desk, behind the other guests. He burst through the front doors into the night air. The parking lot was lit by streetlights, the spaces between them pools of shadow. He ran to his car, fumbling for keys, hands shaking. Unlocked the door, climbed in, locked it behind him. The interior light came on, warm and yellow. He looked in the rearview mirror. Empty, just the seats, the headrests, the darkness beyond the windows. But in the blind spot created by the angle of the mirror, in the space his eyes couldn't quite reach, something was sitting. He could feel the weight of it, the presence pressing against the seat back. He could smell it, that sweet rot, that hollow scent, filling the enclosed space of the car. "I know you're there," he whispered. No response, but the presence didn't vanish. It stayed, patient, waiting. Oscar started the engine, put the car in drive, pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't know where he was going, just away, anywhere but here. He drove through the city, past the buildings and the lights and the people, onto the highway heading north, back toward the woods, back toward the place where he understood the rules. Because here in the city he was vulnerable. The shadows were unpredictable, the blind spots numerous, the spaces between observation infinite. But in the woods he knew what to expect. He knew how to survive. The drive took hours. He didn't stop. The presence in the back seat stayed with him, silent, patient, watching. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he reached the edge of the forest. The road ended in a dirt track, the same track he had driven 3 days ago, before everything changed. He stopped the car and turned around. The back seat was empty. But on the headrest pressed into the fabric were 5 indentations, finger marks, impossibly long, impossibly thin. A message, a promise, a reminder. We are here, we are waiting, we are everywhere you are not looking. Oscar climbed out of the car, leaving the door open, the keys in the ignition. He wouldn't need it anymore. The forest waited before him, dark and deep and full of spaces where things could hide. But it was familiar now. He understood it. He walked into the trees, carrying nothing but his notebooks, his knowledge, his terrible understanding. Behind him, the city receded, the human world fading into the distance. Ahead, the hollow waited. And all around him, in every blind spot, every shadow, every gap in the forest canopy, the Hidebehind stood and watched. They were patient. They were ancient. And they had all the time in the world. Oscar walked deeper into the woods, into the darkness, into the spaces between perception. He didn't look back. He didn't blink. But eventually, everyone has to blink. And when he did, when his eyes closed for that 300-millisecond moment of darkness, he felt something touch his shoulder. Cold, dry, deliberate. "Welcome home," the voice whispered, and it was his own voice, perfectly mimicked, wearing his words like a mask. Oscar opened his eyes and found himself standing in a clearing he didn't recognize, surrounded by birch trees that formed a perfect circle, their white bark glowing in the dawn light. In the center of the circle, suspended between 2 trees, was a body. His body. Or rather, a shell that looked like him, dressed in his clothes, held in place by crystallized sap. The hollowed Oscar turned its head and smiled. "Thank you for showing us the way," it said in Oscar's voice. "We couldn't have done it without you." The real Oscar, the Oscar that still had organs, still had thoughts, still had fear, tried to run. But his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by something that wasn't physical but perceptual. The Hidebehind had learned. They had evolved. They didn't just hunt in the blind spots anymore. They could create them. The Oscar thing stepped forward, its movements wrong, its joints bending in impossible directions. "Your knowledge," it said, "your maps, your understanding of infrastructure, of cities, of where humans cluster, we need it. We need you to show us." "No," Oscar whispered. "Yes," the thing said, and reached for him with hands that had too many fingers. The last thing Oscar saw, before the darkness took him, was his own face smiling back at him from the hollowed shell. And the last thing he heard, as consciousness faded, was the sound of the city calling. The highways, the streets, the millions of humans clustered in their buildings, unaware of the shadows that were coming. The Hidebehinds were expanding. And Oscar Vane was going to lead them home. In the years that followed, strange things began to happen in cities around the world. Unexplained disappearances in urban parks, people vanishing from crowded streets, leaving only their shoes behind. Sightings of tall, thin figures in the gaps between buildings, in the shadows of alleys, in the reflections of windows. The authorities called it mass hysteria. The media called it an urban legend. The internet called it the shadow people phenomenon. But in the remote forests, in the places where the old ways were still remembered, the loggers and rangers and forest dwellers recognized the signs. The Hidebehinds had left the woods. They were learning to hunt in new environments, to occupy new blind spots. The shadow of a skyscraper, the space behind a bus shelter, the gap between a commuter and their reflection in a train window. And they had a guide, a voice, a hollowed shell that wore the face of a man named Oscar Vane. He appeared in photographs sometimes in the corners of frames, standing in the background, smiling, always smiling. He appeared in dreams, whispering about the spaces between, the gaps in perception, the hollow places where the old things lived. And sometimes in the moment before sleep, when the mind was drifting and the guard was down, people heard his voice. "Don't blink," it whispered. "If you blink, they move." But it was too late. They were already here. They had always been here. And they were waiting. In the blind spots, in the shadows, in the spaces you can't quite see. Patient, ancient, hungry. And when you turn around, when you look behind you, when you check the space over your shoulder, they'll be there. They've always been there. Don't blink. Oscar Vane's body was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, victim of a wilderness accident. But his notebooks survived. They were found in his abandoned car, pages filled with diagrams and equations and desperate warnings. Most people dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind. But some people read them, some people believed. And those people learned to walk in groups, to carry strong alcohol, to never turn their backs on empty space. They learned to be vigilant, to be aware, to be afraid of the shadows. It didn't save them all, but it saved some. And in the dark places, in the gaps between perception, the Hidebehinds waited. Patient as stone, ancient as the forests, and always, always behind you. Don't blink. If you blink, they move. Chapter 5: The Periphery. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent her career studying the impossible. As a cognitive psychologist specializing in perception and attention, she had dedicated 15 years to understanding how the human mind constructed reality from incomplete information. She knew about the blind spot, the saccadic masking, the micro moments of darkness that the brain papered over with expectation. She had written papers on inattentional blindness, on change blindness, on the countless ways the mind failed to see what was right in front of it. She thought she understood the limitations of human perception. She was wrong. It started with the photographs, a series of images submitted to her lab by an anonymous source, showing urban landscapes with anomalous figures in the background. Not ghostly apparitions or lens flares, but something else. Dark shapes occupying the spaces between objects, the gaps in the visual field, the blind spots created by camera angles. Elena analyzed them with her students, running them through every filter and enhancement algorithm available. The figures remained consistent across different images, different cameras, different lighting conditions. They were always in the periphery, always just out of focus, always occupying the negative space. "It's pareidolia," her colleague Dr. Chen insisted. "The mind sees patterns in randomness, faces in clouds." "It's not pareidolia," Elena said, pointing to the measurements on her screen. "Look at the proportions, the height, the limb ratios. These are consistent across all images. If it was random noise, we'd see variation. But these are the same, every time." "Then it's a hoax, someone photoshopping figures into backgrounds." "We checked, no digital manipulation. The images are authentic." "Then what?" Elena didn't answer. She had a theory, but it was too insane to voice. a theory based on the notebooks she had found in the university archives, the ones belonging to a Dr. Oscar Vane, missing since 2019, presumed dead. The notebooks described creatures that existed in the gaps of perception, that moved through the blind spots, that hunted by occupying the spaces humans couldn't see. Alina had dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind, until she started seeing the figures in her own peripheral vision. At first she thought it was stress, long hours, too much caffeine, the pressure of the upcoming conference, but the glimpses continued. Tall, thin shapes in the corners of her office, dark silhouettes behind her when she walked down hallways, the sense of being watched, of something occupying the space just behind her shoulder. She started carrying a small bottle of hand sanitizer in her pocket, high alcohol content. It helped, somehow. The presence receded when the alcohol was near. She knew she was going crazy, but she also knew with a certainty that terrified her, that she wasn't. The creatures were real, and they were expanding. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Marcus Webb was 73 years old, a retired logger from northern Minnesota, one of the last survivors of the Arbor Consolidated disaster. He had been hospitalized for pneumonia, and during his recovery, he had seen a news segment about Alina's research. He had called her, insisted on meeting, wouldn't take no for an answer. Alina found him in a nursing home in Duluth, a frail man with hands like twisted oak and eyes that had seen too much. "You're looking in the wrong places," he said without preamble. "The photos, the measurements, the science, it's all good, but you're missing the point." "What is the point, Mr. Webb?" "They're not animals," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're not monsters. They're something else, something that learned to use our own heads against us." "Explain." "The blind spot," Marcus said. "You know about it. The optic nerve, the gap in vision, the brain filling in what it expects. They live there, in the gaps, in the cracks, in the spaces between what we see and what we think we see." "That's impossible." "Everything's impossible until it ain't," Marcus said. "I saw 'em. In 19, when the camp went dark, I saw what they did to Hendricks, what they did to Thomas, what they tried to do to me." "How did you survive?" Marcus reached under his pillow and pulled out a flask, old, battered, filled with clear liquid. "Moonshine, high proof. The smell keeps 'em back, confuses 'em. They can't track the gaps when the air's full of alcohol." "That's," Alina started. "Superstition, folklore, primitive thinking, I know," Marcus smiled, showing yellow teeth. "But it works. It's worked for generations, and it'll keep working long after you're gone." Alina leaned forward. "Mr. Webb, I need you to tell me everything. Everything you saw, everything you know." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but first," he unscrewed the flask and handed it to her. "You need to fill this, and you need to carry it, everywhere, because if you're researching them, they're researching you, and they're patient." Alina took the flask. It was heavier than she expected. "Now," Marcus said, settling back into his pillows, "let me tell you about the Hidebehinds." The story took 3 hours. Marcus spoke in a low monotone, his voice occasionally breaking, his hands shaking. He described the logging camp, the flask rule, the birch tree that leaned. He described Thomas's disappearance, the hollow in the limestone caves, the gallery of preserved victims. He described Oscar Vane. "The surveyor," Marcus said. "Smart man, too smart, thought he could understand him, thought he could reason with him. He was wrong." "What happened to him?" "They took him, but not like the others. They didn't hollow him right away. They used him, wore him like a mask, sent him back to the cities, to the crowds, to show him where to hunt." "That's," Alina couldn't finish. "Monstrous, evil, unthinkable," Marcus laughed, a dry sound like rustling leaves. "They're not evil, doctor, they're not good, they just are. They're predators, we're prey. It's that simple." "How do we stop them?" "We don't," Marcus said. "They're older than us. They'll be here when we're gone, but we can slow them down. We can make their hunting harder." "How?" "Light, bright light, floods every shadow, eliminates every blind spot. They can't exist where there's nowhere to hide." "And the alcohol?" "Confuses their sense of smell. They track us by scent, by the smell of our attention, our fear. The alcohol masks that, creates a cloud they can't penetrate." Alina took notes, filling pages with Marcus's words. When he finished, she had enough material for a book, a research paper, a warning to the world. "What do I do with this?" she asked. "You tell people," Marcus said. "You spread the knowledge. The more people who know, the more who are prepared, the harder their hunting becomes." "They'll think I'm crazy." "They will, but some will listen. Some will believe, and those people will survive." Alina looked at the old man, at his weathered face and haunted eyes. He had survived something that had killed 11 other men. He had carried the knowledge for years, waiting for someone to listen. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus said. "You haven't met him, and once you do, once you see him in your peripheral vision, once you feel him behind you, you'll wish you hadn't." "I'm not afraid." "You should be." Marcus reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "They're not just in the woods anymore. They're in the cities, in the shadows between buildings, in the gaps between streetlights. They're learning, adapting, and they're hungry." Alina squeezed his hand. "Then we'd better learn faster." She published the paper 6 months later. Perceptual Predators, a field guide to the Hidebehind phenomenon. It was rejected by every major journal, ridiculed by her peers, called pseudoscientific nonsense and folklore masquerading as research. But it found an audience online: cryptozoology forums, paranormal communities, survivalist groups, people who had seen things they couldn't explain, felt presences they couldn't identify, experienced the peripheral glitch that the paper described. The knowledge spread, slowly at first, then faster, carried by word of mouth, by shared links, by whispered warnings. Don't walk alone at night. Carry strong alcohol. Never turn your back on empty space. If you see something in your peripheral vision, something tall, something thin, something that shouldn't be there, don't look at it directly. The rules of survival. And they worked. Disappearances in urban parks dropped by 30% in the first year. People reported feeling safer, more aware, more in control of their surroundings. The Hidebehinds were adapting. They were learning to be more cautious, more patient, more selective in their hunting. But they weren't gone. And they weren't forgetting. Alina saw him for the first time at a conference in Chicago. She was giving a presentation on inattentional blindness, showing slides of gorilla suits and basketball passes, when she saw him in the back row. Tall, thin, smiling. Oscar Vane. He looked exactly like his photographs, exactly like the descriptions in his notebooks, but wrong. The smile was too wide. The movements were too smooth. The way he occupied space was off. He was wearing a hollowed shell. She knew it instantly. Their eyes met. Not directly. He was in her peripheral vision, in the gap between the slide projection and the audience. But she felt the contact, the weight of his attention. "Don't blink," he mouthed, and his voice, Oscar's voice but layered with something else, echoed in her mind. She didn't blink. She kept her eyes on the slide, her presentation, her carefully prepared remarks. But she could feel him rising, moving toward the door, leaving the room. When she finished speaking, when she finally allowed herself to look at the back row, he was gone. But on the seat where he had sat, there was a message. 5 indentations in the fabric, finger marks, impossibly long. And a single word scratched into the wood of the seatback. Soon. Alina quit her job 3 weeks later. She moved to a remote cabin in Vermont, surrounded by land she kept illuminated 24 hours a day. Solar panels, battery backups, floodlights that banished every shadow. She continued her research, but quietly now, publishing through encrypted channels, sharing information only with those who had proven themselves. The war was ongoing, ancient predators against scattered, aware, prepared prey. The Hidebehinds were patient, but so was she. And she had something they didn't. She had science, she had community, she had the accumulated knowledge of thousands of people who had learned to see. And she had hope. Not hope that they would win. The Hidebehinds were too old, too established, too perfectly adapted to their niche. But hope that they could coexist, that humans could learn to live with the knowledge of what waited in the gaps, in the shadows, in the blind spots. That they could be vigilant without being terrified, aware without being consumed. She sat in her cabin, surrounded by light, and wrote in her journal. The Hidebehinds are real. They have always been real. They exist in the spaces we cannot see, in the gaps between our perceptions, in the blind spots we carry with us everywhere. They are ancient, patient, endlessly hungry. But we are not helpless. We have learned their rules. We have adapted to their presence. We have turned our weakness, our limited perception, into a strength by becoming aware of the gaps. We know they are there. And knowing is half the battle. The other half. Never blink. Never turn your back. Never walk alone. And always, always carry the light. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the floodlit forest beyond. In the spaces between the lights, in the shadows that remained, she could see them. Watching. Waiting. Patient. But she wasn't afraid. She knew they were there. And she was ready. The war would continue, the hunt would go on. But humanity was learning. And the Hidebehinds were going to find that their prey had become something else. Something aware. Something dangerous. Something that could see. In the city, in the forest, in the spaces between light and dark, the creatures waited. They had waited 10,000 years. They could wait 10,000 more. But they were watching. Always watching. In the blind spots. In the shadows. In the spaces you can't quite see. Don't blink. If you blink, they move. And they're always moving. Closer. Closer. Right behind you. Don't look back. The end. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.